Between 1883 and 1928, the New York police arrested men for selling the Brooklyn Bridge on more than one occasion. And every time, the buyer had paid in good faith, believed he owned it, and had the paperwork to prove it. One man is credited with doing it roughly twice a week for 30 years. He also sold Grant's Tomb, the Statue of Liberty, Madison Square Garden, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was convicted 3 times and died in Sing Sing, having spent his last years in a prison, where the staff reportedly asked him to tell the stories again. But the part worth understanding is not that people fell for it. It is why the trick worked at all, because in 19th century America, buying a bridge and charging tolls on it was a completely normal business, and the buyers were not being stupid. They were being sold a plausible transaction in an economy where that transaction genuinely existed. The fraud only looks absurd from the other side of a change in how America owned things. Start with the bridge, because the bridge is the reason. When the Brooklyn Bridge opened in May 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world and the most conspicuous object in the United States. Its towers were the tallest structures on the continent. It had taken 14 years, cost around $15 million, and killed somewhere over 20 men, including the engineer who designed it. It also charged a toll, a penny to walk across, 5 cents for a horse and rider, more for wagons. The tolls were not a token. They had been designed to pay off the enormous construction debt, and they were collected with the seriousness of a business that needed the money. There were separate rates for pedestrians, for horses, for cattle being driven across, for 1-horse wagons and 2-horse wagons, and for the cable cars that ran along the center of the span. Toll houses stood at each end with men in them taking coins, all day, every day. That is the detail modern readers skip past, and it is load-bearing for everything that follows. The bridge was a revenue-generating asset. Somebody collected money at the end of it every day from tens of thousands of people. In its first year, it carried over 11 million crossings. So a stranger telling you that the bridge could be owned, and that owning it meant collecting those pennies, was not describing a fantasy. He was describing the actual business model of the thing in front of you. It is worth knowing what the bridge had cost to build, because that is part of why it commanded the awe it did. John Augustus Roebling designed it. He was a German-born engineer who had already built suspension bridges at Niagara and Cincinnati, and he had spent years arguing that a span across the East River was possible at all. In 1869, surveying the Brooklyn Tower site, his foot was crushed between a ferry and the pilings. He developed tetanus and died within weeks before construction properly began. His son, Washington Roebling, took over. To sink the foundations, the work used caissons, enormous timber boxes, open at the bottom, pressed down into the riverbed and filled with compressed air to keep the water out. Men worked inside them, digging, in air pressure several times normal. Nobody understood decompression sickness. Men came up too fast and were struck down with what they called caisson disease, joint pain so severe it bent them double, which is where the name, the bends, comes from. Some were paralyzed, some died. Washington Roebling was one of them. He was left partially paralyzed and in chronic pain, and for the remaining 11 years of construction, he directed the work from a window in Brooklyn Heights, watching through a telescope. His wife, Emily Warren Roebling, learned the engineering. She studied catenary curves, cable specifications, and stress analysis, carried her husband's instructions to the site daily, dealt with the contractors and the trustees, and became, for practical purposes, the chief engineer's voice. When the bridge opened, she was the first to cross it. There was also fraud in the construction itself, which is a detail with some irony given what followed. a contractor named J. Lloyd Hague supplied wire for the cables that failed inspection and substituted rejected wire for approved. By the time it was discovered, the bad wire was already woven into the structure and could not be removed. Roebling's solution was to add hundreds of extra wires to compensate, which is why the bridge carries a safety factor far above what its designer originally specified. So the object George Parker was selling had cost 14 years, around 27 deaths, an engineer's life, his son's health, and a cable scandal, and stood over the city as the most visible proof available that Americans built enormous things and made money from them. Selling that was not selling a fantasy. It was selling a share in the most conspicuous success in the country. And private ownership of infrastructure was not exotic in that America. It was the norm. This is worth laying out properly, because it is the single fact that makes the whole story make sense, and it is the one most modern audiences do not have. For the first century of American independence, the default assumption was that infrastructure was built by private companies under a charter from a state legislature and paid for by charging the people who used it. Turnpike companies owned roads and charged you to use them, thousands of miles of them, chartered by state legislatures, paying dividends to shareholders. Private bridge companies were ordinary. Ferries were licensed monopolies. The Roeblings' own earlier bridge at Niagara was privately financed. Much of the rail network, the canals, the water supply in many cities, the gas, and eventually the electricity were all held by private companies with charters to charge the public for access. The numbers are larger than people expect. By the 1830s, several thousand turnpike companies had been chartered across the eastern states, running tens of thousands of miles of road between them. Pennsylvania alone chartered hundreds. They sold shares, held meetings, paid, or more often failed to pay dividends, and put a gate across the road with a man collecting money at it. Bridges were the same, and often better business, because a bridge has no alternative route. A turnpike can be avoided by taking the old road. A river crossing cannot. Charters for bridge companies were fought over in state legislatures precisely because a well-placed crossing was a license to collect money from everybody who needed to get to the other side. The Supreme Court heard a case about exactly this in 1837. The Charles River Bridge dispute in Massachusetts, where the owners of an existing toll bridge argued that chartering a second, free bridge alongside it destroyed the value of their franchise. The court found against them, and the decision is taught to this day as a turning point in how American law weighed private charter rights against public benefit. That case is a century before Parker, and it tells you the question of who owns a bridge and what they may charge for it was live, contested, and worth litigating to the highest court in the country. Water supply was frequently private. Gas lighting was private. When electricity arrived, it was private. Street railways were private. The great trunk railroads were private to a degree that made their owners the most powerful men in America, which is why the period produced the word robber baron in the first place. An immigrant arriving in New York in 1900 came from countries where the same was true. The idea that a large public structure had an owner who took the tolls was not a strange idea to be talked into. It was the ordinary assumption, which is the actual mechanism of this fraud, and it is worth stating plainly before we get to the man. He was not persuading people of something implausible. He was letting them believe something they already believed, and then attaching a false document to it. Now the man. George C. Parker was born in New York around 1860 and worked the confidence trade for something like 3 decades. Much of what is repeated about him comes from newspaper accounts and later retellings, and some of the detail has been polished over the years. The twice-a-week figure is a press flourish more than a ledger. But the convictions are real, the method is documented, and the shape of it is consistent. His pitch varied with the mark. Sometimes he was the bridge's owner, selling up. Sometimes he was an agent for an estate. Sometimes he was a city official, quietly disposing of an asset. He is also said to have worked the tourist trade around the approaches, where a man admiring the structure has already demonstrated that he finds it impressive, which is most of the work done before a word is spoken. What did not vary was the paperwork. Parker produced documents, deeds, transfer papers, letters of authority, and by the accounts of those who dealt with him, they were good. He is said to have rented offices to receive clients in, so that the transaction happened somewhere that looked like a place where transactions happened. He is credited with producing forged documentation, establishing his ownership before a mark ever raised the question. That is the whole craft, and it is not really about the bridge. A confidence trick does not work by making the impossible seem possible. It works by removing, one at a time, every reason a reasonable person would have to stop. The price moved with the buyer. Accounts mentioned sales for as little as $50 and as much as $50,000. That range tells you he was reading people rather than selling a fixed thing. And the buyers were very often new arrivals. Immigrants with savings, looking for a business, in a city where fortunes visibly were being made by people who had bought the right asset at the right moment. Consider that position honestly before deciding they were fools. You have crossed an ocean. You have money you have saved for years. You are in a country whose entire mythology is that ordinary people acquire assets and become wealthy. You do not know which institutions are public and which are private, because the answer differs by state, by city, and by decade. A well-dressed man in an office shows you a deed to a toll bridge you can see from the window, and offers you a price you can afford. The failure is not stupidity, it is the absence of a way to check. That is the part that has changed, and it is the reason the fraud died. In 1883, there was no way for a private buyer to verify who owned a large structure without physically going to a records office, knowing which one, and knowing what to ask for. Title records existed but were fragmentary and local. There was no telephone call to make, no registry to search, no professional layer of title insurance in most transactions. Confirming the story cost more effort than most buyers could manage, and the seller knew exactly how much friction stood between the mark and the truth. It is worth walking through the sale itself as it would have been experienced, because the individual steps are all reasonable, and it is only the sum that is absurd. You are approached, or you answer an advertisement, or you are introduced by somebody who seems to know what they are talking about. The subject is a business opportunity, and it is not pitched as a bargain. A bargain invites suspicion. It is pitched as a problem the seller needs to solve. The seller has inherited an interest and lives elsewhere, or the estate is being wound up. Or there is a dispute among owners, and one party wants out quickly. All of these are ordinary reasons that real assets change hands below their worth, and all of them explain the discount without you having to believe in luck. You are taken to an office. It has furniture a clerk files. Rented by the week, in the accounts that survive, but you have no way of knowing that and no reason to ask. You are shown documents, deeds, transfers, correspondence with officials, sometimes a bound ledger of toll receipts showing what the asset earns. The receipts are the persuasive part, because they answer the only question that really matters. What does it pay? You are given time, not too much, and encouraged to think it over, because pressure produces suspicion and patience produces trust. And if you ask how to verify it, you are told exactly where to go, in terms specific enough to sound helpful and inconvenient enough that you will probably not go. A records office across the city opens certain hours, where you will need to know the correct volume and page. Every step is individually normal. What makes it work is that no single step is the moment where a careful person would stop, and by the time you have taken all of them, you have already spent weeks treating the thing as real. That is the actual architecture of a confidence trick, and it has not changed since. The word confidence in it never referred to the criminal's swagger. It referred to what he was asking you for. The police, meanwhile, kept finding people at the bridge. This is the detail that gives the story its comedy and its evidence at once. New York officers repeatedly had to remove buyers who had arrived to take possession, putting up toll barriers, setting up booths, in some accounts beginning to erect barricades across the walkway to start charging. Think about what that behavior means. These were not people who had been talked into a joke. They had paid, they believed they owned a piece of infrastructure, and they turned up with materials to begin operating it. The belief was complete enough to act on. The other reason the buyers acted as they did is that they had nowhere to complain to. A man who has handed over his savings for a deed to the Brooklyn Bridge is in an unusually bad position. Reporting it means admitting in public that he believed it. Many of the marks were recent immigrants with limited English, uncertain immigration status, or a community reputation to protect. Some had borrowed the money from relatives. That silence is not incidental to the fraud, it is part of the design. Every confidence trick of this era selected, deliberately, for victims who would find reporting more painful than losing the money. Lustig chose a scrap dealer anxious about his social standing for exactly that reason, and was proved right when the man said nothing at all. Which means the arrests we know about are a floor, not a count. Parker was caught when a victim was angry enough, or foolish enough, or simply desperate enough to go to the police. There is no way to know how many did not. It also explains the toll booths. A man who has just realized he may have been cheated has one obvious way to find out without admitting anything to anybody. Go to the bridge and start collecting. If it works, he was right. If somebody stops him, he has his answer, and the police report is written by the officer rather than by him. Parker was arrested and convicted 3 times. The third conviction, in December 1928, came under New York's habitual offender provisions, and it carried a life sentence. A life sentence for selling deeds is a striking outcome, and it says something about how the law of the period worked. The individual frauds were not, on their own, enormous crimes. What produced the sentence was the habitual offender provision, the accumulation, the fact that he had been convicted twice before and had simply resumed. He was sentenced for being incorrigible, rather than for the size of any one theft. He was sent to Sing Sing, where by most accounts he was popular, with the other prisoners and with the guards, who apparently enjoyed his stories. He died there in 1936, having served 8 years. Parker was not alone, and the comparison cases are instructive because they show the same structure working on people who were not immigrants and not poor. The most direct parallel is Victor Lustig, who in 1925 sold the Eiffel Tower for scrap. His method was better documented than Parker's, and it is a small masterpiece of understanding institutions. Lustig read a newspaper piece about the tower being expensive to maintain and the city debating what to do with it. He had counterfeit government stationery made. He invited 6 scrap metal dealers to a meeting at a well-known Paris hotel and presented himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. The tower, he explained, was to be demolished. The contract would go to one of them. The matter was confidential because the public would object. That last element is the crucial one, and it is the same lever Parker used. Secrecy explains why the deal is available, why it must be quick, and why the buyer must not go and ask anybody about it. It converts the very thing that should alert the mark, "This is irregular," into the reason the opportunity exists. Lustig picked the dealer who seemed most eager to establish himself among the Paris business elite, took a bribe on top of the purchase price, and left for Vienna. The victim was too humiliated to report it, so Lustig went back to Paris a few months later and sold the tower again. He was never convicted for either. He eventually went to prison in the United States for counterfeiting and died at Alcatraz. The pattern is identical to the bridge, a real category of transaction. Governments do dispose of assets, cities do sell scrap, a document that looks correct, an official seeming setting, and a verification step the buyer is discouraged from taking. There were dozens of lesser variants running in the same decades. Men sold shares in mines that had no ore, land in Florida that was underwater for most of the year, and interests in oil leases drawn on maps produced for the purpose. The Florida land boom of the 1920s ran on parcels sold sight unseen to buyers in northern states, some of which were genuinely swamp, and some of which did not exist as described. And the Gilded Age had produced exactly the conditions to make New York the best market in the world for this. The city's population more than doubled between 1880 and 1910. Millions of arrivals came through Ellis Island with savings and no local knowledge. Enormous fortunes were being made visibly and quickly by people who were not obviously more capable than anybody else, in ways most observers could not explain. When a society is producing new wealth faster than it is producing understanding of how that wealth is made, the number of people willing to believe an unusual explanation goes up sharply. Not because they are credulous, but because the ordinary explanations have stopped predicting what they can see out of the window. Now the wider point, because this is not really a story about one man's cheek. The Brooklyn Bridge sale is the most famous example of a category that dominated American fraud in that period, selling something the buyer could see but could not verify. Land in states the buyer had never visited, shares in mines that did not exist, interests in oil leases on maps drawn for the purpose. The common structure is always the same. There is a real category of asset that genuinely makes people rich. There is no cheap way to check a specific claim within that category. And there is a document, which looks like the documents that accompany real transactions. Remove the second condition, and the whole class of fraud collapses. That is what happened over the following decades, and it happened through unglamorous administrative change, rather than through anybody getting cleverer. Title recording was standardized and centralized. Title insurance became routine, which meant a professional third party had a financial interest in checking. The telephone made a verifying call trivial. Securities regulation after 1933 created disclosure requirements and a registry for share issues. Public ownership of major infrastructure became the default, so the question, who owns the bridge, acquired an obvious answer for the first time. The Brooklyn Bridge itself is a case in point. It was built by the New York Bridge Company, a private corporation with city investment. The tolls were removed in 1911. Ownership passed fully into public hands, and by the middle of the century, the idea that it might have a private owner had become self-evidently ridiculous, not because people got smarter, but because the world in which it made sense had ended. Which is the useful lesson, and it generalizes well beyond bridges. A confidence trick is not a measure of the victim's intelligence. It is a measure of the gap between what a market makes plausible and what a buyer can practically verify. Widen that gap and frauds appear, regardless of how educated the population is. Close it and they vanish, regardless of how gullible people are supposed to be. And the gap is not fixed. It moves with technology, with regulation, and with which assets are novel enough that nobody has built the checking infrastructure yet. It is worth being precise about how each of those changes close the gap, because they are not obvious and they did not arrive together. Title recording came first and took longest. Land records in the United States were kept county by county, in ledgers, indexed by the names of the parties rather than by the property. To confirm a title, you had to trace the chain of transfers backwards, by hand, hoping nobody had recorded something in the wrong book. That is a job for a specialist, and most buyers did not employ one. Title insurance changed the economics of that. Instead of every buyer performing an expensive search badly, a company performed it once properly and sold a policy against being wrong. The incentive is what matters. The insurer loses money if it fails to check, so checking becomes somebody's business rather than everybody's chore. The telephone reduced verification from a day's journey to a few minutes. That sounds trivial, and it is not. Most fraud depends on a specific amount of friction, enough that the mark does not bother, not so much that they become suspicious about why it is difficult. Cut the cost of asking, and a whole class of deception stops paying. Securities law after 1933 did the same thing for company shares. Before it, an issuer could say almost anything about a mine or a well, and the buyer had no right to underlying information. Disclosure requirements and a central registry meant the claim and the evidence had to be filed in the same place, by the person making the claim, under penalty. And public ownership settled the question the fraud depended on. Once the great bridges, roads, water systems, and parks were held publicly and could not be transferred to a private buyer at all, who owns it stopped being a question with an interesting answer. None of that required the population to become harder to fool. It required institutions to make the truth cheaper to obtain than the lie. Which is why the same shape keeps recurring in categories that feel modern rather than Victorian. Unregistered securities, sold on the basis that the buyer cannot easily check what is behind them. Interests in property developments that do not exist, in countries whose registries are hard to search. Assets whose ownership records are genuinely novel, and where the verification tooling arrived years after the market did. In each case, the pattern is identical to 1883, a real category of asset that genuinely enriches some people, a document that resembles a real one, and a verification step that is expensive or unavailable at the moment the buyer must decide. And the tell is always the same three things together. An explanation for why this opportunity is available to you rather than to somebody better placed, an estate winding up, a private disposal, a confidentiality that happens to exclude the people who could confirm it. A document that establishes the claim rather than evidence that supports it. The distinction matters. A deed asserts ownership. A record in a registry you can search yourself demonstrates it. Fraud lives entirely in the first category because paper is cheap and registries are not. And a verification path that is described helpfully, but is just inconvenient enough that most people will not walk it. Never refused, refusal is alarming. Always made slightly awkward. If those three are present, the age of the asset class is irrelevant. It works the same on a bridge in 1883 and on anything else in any year you like. The technology changes, the gap is the product. There is one more thing about Parker himself that is worth saying, because the sources on him are thinner than the story's fame suggests, and I would rather be straight about that than pretend otherwise. A great deal of what circulates about him comes from newspaper writing of the period and from later popular retellings, and those two categories are not reliable in the same way. The convictions are matters of record. The 1928 sentence under habitual offender provisions is documented. The broad method, forged deeds, rented offices, repeated sales of public structures, is consistent across contemporary accounts. The specifics are shakier. The claim that he sold the bridge twice a week for 30 years is the sort of figure a headline produces rather than a court record. The list of other properties he sold varies between tellings. The detail that guards at Sing Sing enjoyed his company is the kind of thing that gets added to a story about a likable rogue, whether or not anybody wrote it down at the time. I am telling it with those caveats because the argument does not depend on Parker being exactly as advertised. Even if he sold the bridge a dozen times rather than 1,000, the fact that it could be sold at all repeatedly to different people over decades in the largest city in the country is the thing worth understanding. The individual conman is the least interesting part. What is interesting is the condition of the market that made his product saleable, and that condition is documented far better than he is. There is a coda about the phrase itself, because it outlived everybody involved. If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you, entered American speech from these cases, and is still in use nearly a century and a half later. It has become shorthand for extreme credulity, the definitive example of believing something no sensible person would believe, which is, given everything, slightly unfair to the buyers. They were not believing something absurd. They were believing something that was true of most of the roads, ferries, canals, and bridges around them, presented on paper that looked correct, by a man in an office, about a structure that visibly took money from the public every single day. The absurdity is entirely retrospective. It exists because ownership of American infrastructure changed, and because verifying a claim became something anybody could do in a minute, rather than something almost nobody could do at all. George Parker sold the Brooklyn Bridge for 30 years to people who were, in the terms of their own time, making a reasonable investment decision on inadequate information. That is not a story about idiots. It is a story about what happens when an economy produces assets faster than it produces the means of checking who owns them. And it is worth remembering which of those two things is still, reliably, the slower one. New assets arrive because somebody sees an opportunity and moves. Verification arrives because a registry is built, a law is drafted, a professional class forms around checking, and an insurer decides the risk is measurable enough to price. The first can happen in a season. The second takes years, and it only begins in earnest after enough people have lost enough money to make it politically worth doing. That lag is not a flaw anybody has failed to fix. It is structural, and it reopens every time a genuinely new kind of asset appears. Which means the useful question, standing in front of any opportunity, is not whether it sounds too good. Plenty of real fortunes have sounded ridiculous, and the men who bought railway shares in 1850 or bridge charters in 1830 were not wrong. The question is narrower and much more answerable. Can I check this cheaply, from a source that has no interest in the answer? If yes, the ordinary risks apply, and you may lose your money in the ordinary way. If no, if the only evidence is a document handed to you by the person who wants your money, then you are standing exactly where those men stood on the Brooklyn side in 1883, holding a deed, looking at a structure that visibly took money from the public every day of the year. They were not fools, they simply had no way to ask. Oil floats on water. Every child knows it. It is the first thing anyone learns about liquids, and it is the entire basis of a fraud that generated around $175 million of paper backed by nothing, brought down 2 Wall Street brokerages, and came within a few days of destroying American Express. The method was this: fill a storage tank with seawater, float a layer of vegetable oil on top. When the inspector arrives and lowers his measuring stick through the hatch, it comes up wet with oil because the top of the tank is oil. He certifies the tank as full. A warehouse receipt is issued. That receipt is a negotiable financial instrument, and it can be borrowed against. The tank contains almost nothing. This is the story of what happens when the entire financial system's verification of an asset consists of a man looking at the top of it, and of why almost nobody has heard of it, despite the fact that it very nearly took down one of the most trusted institutions in America. Start with the man, because he is unusually well documented and the pattern of his career matters. Anthony De Angelis, universally called Tino, was born in the Bronx in 1915 to Italian immigrant parents. He left school early and went into the food business, and by his 30s, he was running a substantial meat-packing operation. He was, by every account, physically imposing in the opposite direction, short, heavy, and enormously energetic. People who dealt with him described a man of overwhelming confidence who talked continuously and knew every detail of his business. The important part of his early career is that he had already been caught once. In the 1950s, his company supplied meat to the federal school lunch program. An investigation found it had been overcharging the government and shipping uninspected product. The company went bankrupt. He was investigated and he emerged without a conviction. That is worth registering. By 1960, he had a documented history of defrauding a government program, and it did not prevent him from borrowing enormous sums from some of the most sophisticated lenders in the world a few years later. Now the business he moved into, which is where the opportunity lay. In the late 1950s, the United States was running large agricultural surpluses, and federal policy encouraged exporting them. Vegetable oil, soybean, and cottonseed was a major commodity in that trade, sold to Europe and increasingly to Spain and to the Soviet bloc under various arrangements. De Angelis founded the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Company in Bayonne, New Jersey, and became a dominant force in that export trade very quickly. At his peak, he was reportedly handling a substantial share of America's vegetable oil exports. To trade at that scale, you need two things: storage and credit. The storage was a tank farm on the Bayonne waterfront, a field of large cylindrical tanks connected by pipework, holding oil awaiting shipment. The credit came from the way commodity finance works, and this is the mechanism that has to be understood properly. A commodity trader does not usually own the money to buy the commodity. He borrows against the commodity itself. The oil sits in a tank. A warehouse company certifies how much is there. That certificate, a warehouse receipt, is handed to a lender as collateral. The receipt is not a description. It is a legal instrument. It says a named quantity of a named commodity is held on the holder's behalf, and it can be pledged, traded, and lent against, exactly like a security. So the entire structure rests on the accuracy of the certificate, and the certificate rests on someone physically checking the tank. The company that did the checking in this case was a subsidiary of American Express. That detail is the reason the story matters, and it needs explaining because it sounds implausible now. American Express in 1963 was primarily known for travelers' checks and its new credit card. But it also owned a field warehousing business, American Express Field Warehousing Corporation, which performed exactly this function, taking custody of a client's goods on the client's own premises and issuing receipts that banks would accept as collateral. Field warehousing is a legitimate and long-established practice. The warehouseman leases a corner of the borrower's property, posts a custodian, and certifies what is stored there. The lender gets an independent verification without the goods having to move. The independence is the entire product. It is the only thing the customer is buying. Now the inspection itself and how it failed. The custodians employed at Bayonne were, in practice, largely drawn from Allied's own workforce and paid nominally by the warehousing subsidiary. That is the first structural problem. The people certifying the oil worked, day to day, alongside the people whose oil it was. The physical measurement was a dip. A weighted tape or stick is lowered through a hatch in the top of the tank until it reaches the bottom, and the depth of liquid is read off. Depth plus tank dimensions gives volume. The problem, stated in one sentence, is that a dip measures depth, not contents. If a tank is filled mostly with water and topped with oil, the dip records a full tank. The stick comes up wet with oil along its whole length, because oil clings and coats it as it is withdrawn. There was, in the standard procedure, no requirement to sample from the bottom. De Angelis exploited this in increasingly ambitious ways. Tanks were filled with seawater and topped with oil. Some tanks reportedly contained a small tube of oil inside a much larger volume of water, positioned so that a dip through the hatch went down the tube. Oil was moved between tanks ahead of inspections, so the same physical oil was counted repeatedly as inspectors worked through the farm. The tanks were also interconnected by pipes, which meant a single quantity could be pumped from one to another as required. None of this is technically sophisticated. It is the sort of thing a person works out by thinking about the problem for an afternoon. What made it work was not cleverness. It was that nobody was checking in a way that could have detected it. And there were warnings, which is the part that makes it more than a curiosity. Allied certified holdings eventually exceeded, on paper, the entire quantity of vegetable oil that the United States Department of Agriculture believed existed in the country. Somebody comparing the receipts against the national inventory would have found an impossibility. An anonymous letter was reportedly sent to American Express raising concerns about the Bayonne operation. A short investigation was conducted. It did not find the fraud. Traders in the market noticed that Allied's reported volumes were implausible relative to the size of the trade. Some acted on that suspicion. Most did not. The information required to expose this was, in principle, publicly available. What was missing was anybody whose job it was to look at it. Now the second half of the fraud, which is what turned a large problem into a systemic one. Holding warehouse receipts allowed De Angelis to borrow. He used that borrowing to speculate in vegetable oil futures, betting that prices would rise. He had a specific reason to expect them to. Negotiations were underway for a major sale of American agricultural commodities to the Soviet Union, and he anticipated that a large purchase would drive prices up sharply. So he took an enormous long position, financed by loans secured on collateral that did not exist. His futures trading ran through brokerage houses, principally Ira Haupt and Company and Williston and Bean. Those firms extended him credit to hold his positions, and they in turn borrowed from banks against the same warehouse receipts. The receipts were therefore doing double duty, securing the loans that funded the trading and underpinning the brokers who were carrying the positions. Then, in November 1963, the expected Soviet deal did not materialize in the form he had assumed. Vegetable oil prices fell. A falling market against a leveraged long position produces margin calls. The brokers demanded more collateral. De Angelis could not produce it because there was nothing behind the position but water. On the 18th of November, Allied filed for bankruptcy. And then the receipts were tested and the tanks were opened. What investigators found, when they finally measured properly, was that of the roughly 937 million pounds of vegetable oil recorded on the warehouse receipts. Only around 100 million pounds actually existed. Somewhere in the region of 80 to 90% of the collateral was seawater. The consequences arrived immediately and in the worst possible week. Ira Haupt and Company was a member firm of the New York Stock Exchange, with more than 20,000 customer accounts. Its exposure to Allied was catastrophic, and it could not meet its obligations. Williston and Bean was similarly stricken. On the 22nd of November 1963, the New York Stock Exchange suspended Ira Haupt from trading. That afternoon, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The exchange closed early amid the news and remained closed the following Monday for the funeral. Those few days of closure are, by most accounts, what prevented a far worse outcome. They gave the exchange, the banks and the Federal Reserve time to organize a rescue of Haupt's customers without a panic running through an open market. It also means that the salad oil scandal was permanently overshadowed. It broke on the day of the assassination, and it disappeared from public memory almost immediately. That is a substantial part of the answer to why nobody has heard of it. Now, American Express, because this is where the story becomes genuinely instructive. Its warehousing subsidiary had issued the receipts. Those receipts were now known to be worthless, and the holders, banks, and brokers wanted to be paid. The legal position was arguable. The subsidiary was a separate corporation, and there was a serious case that the parent had no obligation to cover its liabilities. Bankruptcy of the subsidiary was a real option, and some advisors urged it. The company chose not to take it. It announced that it would stand behind the obligations, and it eventually paid out something in the region of $60 million, an enormous figure for the period, and a substantial fraction of the company's net worth. The reasoning was that American Express sold trust. Its travelers' checks were accepted worldwide precisely because people believed the company would honor them. A parent that walked away from its subsidiary certificates would have been telling the world something about itself that no marketing could undo. That decision is one of the more interesting judgments in American corporate history, because it was expensive, legally unnecessary, and almost certainly correct. The share price collapsed regardless. It fell by roughly half in the weeks after the scandal broke. And that collapse is the reason a great many people have heard of this story without realizing it, because of who bought. A young investor named Warren Buffett, then running a partnership in Omaha, took the view that the underlying business was undamaged. The traveler's check and card operations were unaffected by a warehousing subsidiary's failure. What had been hit was sentiment, not earnings. He famously spent time in Omaha restaurants watching whether people were still paying with American Express cards and checks. They were. Nobody had stopped trusting the company at the counter. He put a very substantial portion of his partnership's capital into the stock, a concentration that would be considered reckless by conventional standards, and the position produced enormous returns as the price recovered. It is one of the founding stories of his reputation, and its logic depends entirely on the distinction between a business being damaged and a business being frightening. Now the mechanism, stated as generally as it deserves. The fraud worked because verification of the collateral was delegated, and the delegate's method could not detect the fraud even when performed honestly. Notice that this is not primarily a story about corrupt inspectors, although there was corruption. The deeper problem is that a dip test is a valid procedure for the question, how deep is the liquid, and an invalid procedure for the question, how much oil is here? Everybody involved was answering the first question and believed they were answering the second. That gap between the question, the check actually answers, and the question everyone assumes it answers, is where this class of fraud lies. And it recurs constantly, in forms that look nothing like a tank of seawater. An auditor confirms a bank balance by writing to the bank and receives a reply on the bank's letterhead. That verifies that a letter arrived, not that the money exists, which is precisely how the Parmalat fraud ran for years on a forged confirmation. A ratings agency evaluates a pool of mortgages using historical default data. That verifies how similar loans behaved in the past, not how these loans will behave, which is the 2008 story in one sentence. An exchange confirms a crypto firm's reserves with a snapshot at a moment in time. That verifies what was in the wallet at that moment, not whether it was borrowed for the occasion. In every case, the check is real, performed by real people, producing a real document. And in every case, it answers a slightly different question from the one the entire structure depends on. There is a second mechanism here too, and it is about concentration of function. The warehouseman was paid by the person whose goods he was certifying. The custodians were drawn from that person's workforce. The physical premises belonged to that person. The only genuinely independent element was the name on the receipt. Field warehousing is designed to import independence into a situation where the goods cannot be moved. When every practical element of it is supplied by the borrower, what remains is a letterhead. That pattern of verification service where the verifier is selected, paid, and hosted by the party being verified did not go away in 1963. It is the structure of credit rating, of external audit, and of a good deal of financial certification generally. The reforms that followed are worth noting because they were real. Warehouse receipt practices were tightened, with more rigorous requirements for the independence of custodians and for physical verification. Bottom sampling, actually drawing liquid from the base of a tank rather than dipping through the top, became standard practice for exactly this reason. The brokerage failures also contributed to a longer argument about protecting customers of failed member firms, which eventually produced the Securities Investor Protection Corporation in 1970. ERA-Hop's 20,000 customers had been rescued by an ad hoc arrangement organized in a crisis. The case for a standing mechanism was made considerably stronger by it. De Angelis himself was convicted of fraud and conspiracy and served around 7 years. He returned afterwards to business and was involved in further legal difficulties in later decades. But the individual is the least interesting part of this. He was an opportunist who noticed a gap. The gap is the story. It is worth going through the numbers properly, because the scale is difficult to believe, and the arithmetic is what makes it real. The warehouse receipts recorded roughly 937 million pounds of vegetable oil. At the prices of the period, that represented something in the region of $175 million of collateral. To put that in proportion, it was, on paper, more vegetable oil than the entire United States was believed to hold. The Department of Agriculture published inventory figures. Anyone who compared Allied's certified holdings against the national total would have found that one company in New Jersey was claiming to store more oil than existed in the country. That comparison required no investigative skill whatsoever. It required one person, with both numbers, doing a subtraction. The reason nobody did it is instructive and entirely mundane. The banks lending against the receipts were looking at the receipts. The warehousing subsidiary was looking at the tanks. The brokers were looking at the margin. The Department of Agriculture was compiling statistics for agricultural policy. Every party had part of the picture, and no party had a reason to assemble it. The information was not hidden. It was distributed, and nobody's job description included joining it up. That is a far more common failure than concealment, and considerably harder to legislate against. Now the brokerage collapse in more detail, because the mechanics of how it spread are the systemic part. Ira Haupt and Company was not a marginal operation. It was an established New York Stock Exchange member firm with more than 20,000 customer accounts, and its business was ordinary retail and institutional brokerage. Its exposure came through financing De Angelis's futures positions. To carry those positions, it had borrowed heavily from banks, pledging the warehouse receipts it held as collateral. So when the receipts proved worthless, Haupt owed the banks money it could not repay against security that did not exist. The firm's capital was wiped out several times over. The critical problem was not Haupt's own solvency. It was that 20,000 customers had securities and cash held at the firm. In 1963, there was no federal insurance for brokerage customers. If Haupt was liquidated in the ordinary way, those customers were unsecured creditors, standing in line behind the banks. That is the mechanism by which a fraud about vegetable oil reaches ordinary people who never traded a commodity in their lives. The New York Stock Exchange, under its president Keith Funston, organized a rescue. The exchange put up a substantial fund, member firms contributed, and the banks that were owed money by Haupt agreed to accept less than they were due. That last point is worth pausing on. The banks took a haircut voluntarily, because a disorderly failure with the market already unsettled was worse for them than a negotiated one. It is an early example of a private sector resolution assembled under time pressure, and it worked. Customers were made whole, the firm was wound up, and the timing genuinely mattered. The exchange closed on the afternoon of the 22nd of November because of the assassination, and remained closed on the Monday for the funeral. That gave roughly 2 clear days in which the rescue could be assembled, without a market open to price the panic. Nobody planned that. It is one of the more consequential coincidences in American financial history, and it is the reason this episode is remembered as a scandal rather than as a crash. Now, the question of why the fraud was not detected earlier, because there were several opportunities. The first is the national inventory comparison already described. The second is that the physical operation was visible. Bayonne is not remote. The tank farm sat on the waterfront in plain view, and oil was being moved between tanks by pipe ahead of inspections. That activity was observable by anyone who watched the site over a period. The third is that market participants noticed. Allied's claimed volumes implied a share of the export trade that some traders regarded as implausible. Suspicion existed in the market well before the collapse. The fourth is the anonymous letter reportedly received by American Express, which prompted an internal inquiry that did not find the fraud. So this was not a case of a perfectly concealed scheme. It was a case of multiple partial signals, none of which reached anyone with both the authority and the incentive to act. The incentive point deserves emphasis. The warehousing subsidiary was earning fees from Allied. The brokers were earning commissions on an extremely active account. The banks were earning interest on secured lending. Every party in the chain was being paid, and paid well, by the continuation of the arrangement. That is not corruption in the sense of anybody taking a bribe. It is the ordinary and entirely legal situation in which the people best placed to detect a problem are the people who would lose income by detecting it, which is a structural argument for separating verification from the revenue it protects, and one that the financial system has never fully accepted because the alternative is expensive and the failures are infrequent. There is another dimension worth drawing out, about what field warehousing was actually for. It exists to solve a genuine problem. A trader has goods on his own premises and needs to borrow against them. The lender cannot practically take possession. You cannot move a tank farm and cannot station its own staff at every borrower's site. So a third party is inserted. It leases the space, takes legal custody, and certifies what is there. The lender relies on the third party's independence rather than on the borrower's honesty. The design is sound. What failed was every practical element of its implementation. The custodians came from the borrower's workforce. The premises were the borrower's. The measurement method could not detect substitution. The fees were paid by the borrower. Strip those away, and the independence that the entire arrangement exists to provide is reduced to a name printed on a document. There is a general lesson in that which extends well beyond warehousing. When a control depends on independence, the question to ask is not whether the independent party is reputable. It is which practical elements of the arrangement they actually control: the staff, the premises, the method, the payment, and how many of those belong to the party being checked. If the answer is most of them, the control is decorative regardless of whose name is on it. Now, what changed afterwards? Because the reforms were specific and they worked. Bottom sampling became standard. Instead of dipping through the top hatch, inspectors draw liquid from the base of the tank, where water would sit. That single procedural change makes this exact fraud impossible. It is worth noticing how cheap that fix was. It required no new technology, no legislation, no institution. It required somebody to recognize that the existing procedure answered the wrong question, and to change which end of the tank was sampled. The expensive part was not the remedy. It was working out that a remedy was needed. Custodian independence requirements were tight, so that warehousing staff could not simply be the borrower's employees under a different payslip. And the brokerage failure fed directly into the argument that produced the Securities Investor Protection Corporation in 1970, which now guarantees customer accounts at failed broker-dealers. The 20,000 hopped customers had been rescued by improvisation. SIPC exists, so the next 20,000 would not have to be. There is one more comparison worth making, because it shows how durable the pattern is. In the 2000s, a series of frauds involved commodities financing in China, in which the same metal stockpiles were pledged repeatedly to multiple lenders. Warehouse receipts were issued against inventory that had already been pledged elsewhere, or that did not exist in the quantities stated. The commodity was different. The country was different. The mechanism was identical. A physical stockpile that lenders could not practically inspect, certified by a party whose incentives were aligned with the borrower, using a check that could not detect the specific deception being practiced. 60 years, 2 continents, and the same structure, because the underlying problem is not about oil or metal. It is about what happens when a financial claim rests on a physical fact that only one party can observe. There is a detail worth ending on, and it captures the whole thing. When investigators finally examined the Bayonne tank farm properly, some of the tanks contained no oil at all. Others contained a thin surface layer. The pipework connecting them had been used to move the same oil around ahead of inspections. At no point did the fraud require anything to be hidden from view. The tanks were there. The inspectors visited. The receipts were issued by a subsidiary of one of the most respected companies in America and accepted by banks with substantial credit departments. The entire structure was visible, and it was verified, and it was worth almost nothing, because everybody was measuring the top of the tank. Which is the question worth carrying away from it? When somebody tells you an asset has been verified, the useful thing to ask is not whether the check was performed. It almost always was. The useful question is what precisely the check would have detected, and whether the thing you are actually worried about is on that list. There is a further question worth asking, which is why this particular commodity. Vegetable oil is close to ideal for a fraud of this kind, and the reasons are worth listing because they define the risk category. It is a liquid, so it takes the shape of its container and cannot be counted. A warehouse of crates can be tallied, a tank cannot. It is fungible. 1 gallon of soybean oil is interchangeable with any other, so there is nothing to trace, no serial number, no distinguishing mark. Moving the same oil between tanks produces no evidence of having done so. It is stored in opaque containers that cannot be inspected without specialized access. You cannot look at a tank and see how full it is. And it is less dense than water, which is the specific physical property that makes the substitution work. A denser commodity floating on a cheaper one would not have permitted this. Put those 4 together, and you have an asset class where the gap between the claim and the reality can only be closed by a physical measurement that almost nobody performs correctly. The same list applies with adjustments to a great many things: bulk grain in a silo, crude in a terminal, metal in a stockyard, where the individual ingots are indistinguishable and the pile is too large to count, digital balances in an account, where the entire asset is a number in a database controlled by the party you are checking. That last one is worth dwelling on, because it is the modern version and it is worse. A tank of oil at least has to exist somewhere. Water had to be pumped into it. There was a physical operation on a waterfront that a determined observer could have watched. A balance in a ledger has no such constraint. There is no equivalent of the pipework at Bayonne, nothing to move, nothing to observe, no seawater to buy. The falsification is a keystroke, which means the verification problem that destroyed IRA Haupt in 1963 has not been solved so much as made harder, and the checks that are performed on digital reserves today are frequently the direct equivalent of a dip through the top hatch, a snapshot at a moment chosen in advance of a figure the checked party controls. Now, a word about the people who were owed money, because it is easy to discuss this as an abstract failure. The banks that lent against the receipts were substantial institutions and could absorb the loss. The brokerages could not, and their failure put 20,000 ordinary customer accounts at risk. People whose only connection to vegetable oil was that they happened to hold shares at a firm that had lent against it. That is the characteristic shape of a collateral failure. The loss does not stay with the party that made the bad judgment. It travels along the chain of obligations until it reaches somebody who had no way of knowing the chain existed. A retail customer of IRA Haupt could not have discovered that their broker was financing a New Jersey oil trader. The information was not available to them, and it would not have been meaningful if it had been. They were exposed to a risk they could not see, assess, or avoid. That is the argument for structural protections rather than disclosure. Telling people more would not have helped. There was no action available to them. What helped was an insurance scheme that made the question irrelevant, which is what SIPC eventually provided. There is also a point worth making about how respectable this all looked. The receipts carried the name of American Express, one of the most trusted commercial names in the country, a company whose entire business was built on being believed. The lenders were established banks with credit departments. The brokers were New York Stock Exchange member firms. The commodity was a mundane agricultural product traded under federal export programs. Nothing about the arrangement looked exotic. There was no offshore structure, no novel instrument, no promise of extraordinary returns. It was ordinary secured lending against a warehoused commodity, which is one of the oldest and most conservative forms of finance there is. That is precisely why it worked at scale. A structure that looks unusual attracts scrutiny. A structure that looks entirely routine does not, and routine is where the largest failures tend to live. The frauds that reach $175 million are almost never the ones that look like frauds. They are the ones that look like Tuesday. And there is a final observation about American Express that is worth separating from the Buffett story, because it tends to get swallowed by it. The decision to honor the receipts was made when the legal obligation was genuinely doubtful, and the sum was large enough to threaten the company. It would have been entirely defensible to let the subsidiary fail. What the board appears to have understood is that its actual product was not travelers' checks. It was the belief that a piece of American Express paper would be honored. A company in that business cannot selectively decline to honor its paper because the willingness is the product. $60 million bought the continuation of that belief. Measured against what the alternative would have cost, it was not expensive. That is a more interesting corporate lesson than the investment story, and it is one that recurs whenever a firm whose business is trust discovers it has a subsidiary it would rather disown. There is one more strand that deserves attention, because it is the part most likely to be repeated. Consider how the fraud grew. It did not begin at $175 million. It began small, a modest overstatement, easily made, easily concealed, and immediately profitable. Once made, it could not be reversed. A trader who has borrowed against oil that does not exist cannot simply stop. The shortfall has to be carried, and carrying it requires more borrowing, which requires more collateral, which requires a larger overstatement. That is the internal logic of this class of fraud, and it explains the trajectory. Each step is a response to the previous step. The alternative at every point is to admit the earlier one, and the cost of admission rises with every month. By the end, the position was so large that the only route out was for the market to move dramatically in his favor, which is why the future speculation happened. It was not greed layered on top of the fraud. It was the fraud's only exit. That pattern recurs almost universally in cases of this kind. The initial deception is small and opportunistic. The escalation is compelled. And the final, spectacular gamble is not recklessness but arithmetic. The only outcome that repays the whole is an improbable one, so the improbable one is what gets bet on, which has a practical implication for anyone looking for these things. The tell is rarely the size of the position. It is the asterisk direction of travel, an operation that must keep growing to remain solvent, where a pause would expose it. Businesses that can stand still are in a different category from businesses that cannot. There is also a question about what the lenders thought they were doing, and it is less obvious than it first appears. They were not being negligent by the standards of the time. Lending against warehouse receipts issued by a subsidiary of American Express was, in 1963, about as conservative as secured commodity lending got. The receipt was the standard instrument. The warehouseman was reputable. The commodity was real and had an active market with observable prices. Every element of the arrangement was the recommended practice. That is the uncomfortable finding. This was not a case of lenders reaching for yield or cutting corners. It was a case of the recommended practice containing a defect that nobody had examined, because it had worked for decades and there was no reason to look. Procedures acquire authority through age. A method that has produced no failures in 50 years is trusted precisely because of that record, and the record is evidence about the past environment, not about a new one containing a person who has thought carefully about the top of the tank. Which is why the most dangerous controls are the oldest ones. Nobody audits a procedure that has never failed. And it is worth stating what would actually have caught it, since several things would have. Drawing a sample from the bottom of the tank, comparing the certified national total against Department of Agriculture inventory figures, weighing a tank rather than dipping it, rotating custodians so that no inspector was permanently embedded with one client, requiring the warehouseman to be paid by the lender rather than the borrower. None of those is expensive or technically demanding. Every one of them was available in 1963. They were not done because nobody had asked the question that makes them obvious. What would this check fail to detect? And that question is the entire content of the lesson. There is a small postscript that says something about how memory works in finance. The Bayonne tank farm is still there in one form or another. The waterfront was redeveloped, the site changed hands, and the tanks that held the seawater are long gone. There is no plaque. The phrase salad oil scandal survives mainly in footnotes and in the Buffett literature, where it appears as background to a stock purchase rather than as an event in its own right. Meanwhile, the specific procedural fix it produced, sampling from the bottom of a tank rather than the top, is now so standard that the people who perform it have no idea why it is done that way, which is, in its own quiet manner, the best possible outcome. The lesson was absorbed into a routine, and routines survive long after the stories that produced them are forgotten. That is what a functioning institution actually looks like. Not a memory of the disaster, but a procedure nobody questions because it has been correct for 60 years. The danger, of course, is that the same durability is what made the original procedure trusted in the first place. In 1982, the President of the United States signed a law intended to rescue the American savings and loan industry. Standing at the signing table, he called it the most important legislation for financial institutions in 50 years. He was right about that. Within 8 years, more than 1,000 of those institutions had failed, and the cleanup cost American taxpayers something on the order of $124 billion. The law did not fail. It worked exactly as written. That is the problem. Because what it did, deliberately, as policy, was hand erect industry the freedom to gamble, while leaving the government's guarantee on the losses in place. Free the upside, guarantee the downside, and then act surprised at what people did with it. This is the largest financial failure in American history before 2008, and almost nobody can tell you how it happened. Start with what a savings and loan actually was, because the institution has nearly vanished, and its business model is the whole story. An S&L, a thrift, took deposits from local people and lent them out as 30-year fixed-rate mortgages. That was essentially all it did. It was chartered for that purpose, restricted to that purpose, and for 40 years it was the backbone of American home ownership. The industry had a joke about itself, the 363 rule. Pay 3% on deposits, charge 6% on mortgages, and be on the golf course by 3 o'clock. That is funny because it was true, and it describes a business that required no particular skill. The margin was legislated. Regulation capped what banks and thrifts could pay depositors, so no one could compete by offering more. The spread was safe as long as one condition held, that short-term rates stayed below long-term rates. Every thrift in America was making the same bet without anyone describing it as a bet. Borrow short, lend long, and collect the difference. Then the 1970s happened. Inflation went from under 2% in the early 60s to double digits by 1979. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker responded by pushing interest rates to levels no one had seen. The federal funds rate touched 20% in 1981. Consider what that did to a thrift's balance sheet. On the asset side, it held 30-year mortgages written years earlier at 6%. Those cannot be repriced. The borrower has a contract. On the liability side, it owed depositors, and depositors could now earn double-digit returns in the new money market funds, which were not subject to Regulation Q. So money simply walked out of the door. The industry called it disintermediation, which is a mild word for customers leaving because you are legally forbidden to pay them a competitive rate. To keep deposits, thrifts eventually had to pay 10, 12, 14% on assets earning 6%. That is not a bad quarter. That is a negative margin on the entire balance sheet, structurally, with no way to fix it, because the assets are locked for decades. By the early 1980s, the industry was insolvent, not struggling, insolvent. If you marked the mortgage portfolios to market, the collective net worth of American savings and loans was somewhere around negative $100 billion, which brought the government to a choice, and the choice is the hinge of this whole story. Option 1 was to recognize reality, close the insolvent institutions, pay off the insured depositors, and absorb the cost immediately. The estimated bill in 1982 was something in the region of $25 billion. That was politically impossible. $25 billion was real money. It would have to be appropriated, and it would mean a sitting Congress admitting that a beloved industry, the people who financed American homes, was bankrupt on their watch. Option 2 was to let them trade out of it. Give the thrifts new powers, let them earn their way back to solvency, and hope the problem grew smaller rather than larger. The government chose option 2, not out of stupidity and not really out of corruption, though corruption followed. It chose it because the immediate cost of option 1 was visible, and the eventual cost of option 2 was not. That is the same mechanism that killed equitable life on the other side of the Atlantic, arriving from the opposite direction. A cost that does not have to be recognized today gets treated as a cost that does not exist. So what did the new powers actually consist of? 2 laws, and the second one matters most. The Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980 began phasing out Regulation Q, so thrifts could finally pay competitive rates on deposits. That part was necessary and sensible. The rate cap had become a trap. The same act also raised federal deposit insurance from $40,000 per account to $100,000. Hold that number. It is the most consequential single change in this story, and at the time it attracted almost no attention. It was reportedly agreed late in a conference committee, without extensive analysis, at the industry's request. Then came Garnson-German in 1982, which is the law being signed in the opening of this story. It allowed thrifts to move far beyond home mortgages, into commercial real estate, into consumer and commercial lending, into direct equity investment in development projects. Some states went further still. Texas and California in particular let state-chartered thrifts invest in essentially anything. An institution chartered to write suburban mortgages could now be a property developer, a venture capitalist, or the owner of a casino. Now put the two halves together, because separately they are defensible and together they are radioactive. A thrift that is already insolvent has, in economic terms, nothing left to lose. Its own capital is gone. Any gamble it takes is played with other people's money. The depositors, meanwhile, have no reason to care what it does, because their deposits are federally insured up to $100,000. They are not lending to the institution. They are lending to the United States government and shopping purely on rate. So the discipline that normally restrains a lender, depositors withdrawing money from an institution that looks reckless, was switched off by statute. The result is a machine with a very simple logic. If the gamble pays, the owners keep the profit. If it fails, the insurance fund pays the depositors. Heads I win, tails the taxpayer loses. Economists call this moral hazard. It is normally a subtle effect at the margin. Here it was the operating principle of an entire industry, made explicit by law. And there was an accelerant nobody had planned for: brokered deposits. Deposit brokers would gather money from investors across the country and place it wherever rates were highest, in $100,000 blocks precisely sized to the insurance limit. A thrift in a small town could raise hundreds of millions of dollars in weeks, simply by advertising the best rate in the country. There was no risk premium. Why would a depositor demand one? The government was standing behind every dollar. So the institutions in the worst condition, the ones that most needed to attract money and had the least to lose by paying up, could grow fastest. The market for deposits was rewarding exactly the wrong behavior, and it was doing so because the insurance had removed the only signal that would have stopped it. Some thrifts grew tenfold in 3 or 4 years. That growth was not evidence of success. It was the shape of the disease. Then look at what the money bought. Raw land in the Texas desert, purchased at prices that assumed development which never came. Half-built condominium complexes in Florida. Office parks in cities that already had too much office space. Junk bonds in enormous quantities. In several documented cases, outright fraud loans to friends, inflated appraisals, and property flipped repeatedly between related parties to manufacture paper gains that supported still more borrowing. The Texas boom is the clearest example. Thrift lending poured into commercial property just as oil prices collapsed, which meant the regional economy underpinning every one of those valuations disappeared at the moment the buildings were completed. By the late 1980s, parts of Texas had office vacancy rates above 30%, and the buildings were collateral for loans made by institutions that had no capital. Now the accounting, because this is how it stayed hidden. The regulator permitted what were called regulatory accounting principles, a set of conventions that diverged deliberately from standard accounting. Under wrap, a thrift could count supervisory goodwill as capital. When a healthy thrift absorbed a failing one, the difference between the failed institution's liabilities and its assets could be booked as an asset and amortized over as long as 40 years. Read that carefully. A whole was recorded as an asset. Acquiring a bankrupt institution made your balance sheet look stronger. Losses on sales of assets could be deferred and spread over the remaining life of the asset sold. Appraisals could be optimistic without consequence. The capital requirement itself was lowered from 5% to 3%. None of this was hidden. It was published policy. It simply meant that the number describing an institution's solvency had become detached from whether the institution was solvent. And then there was forbearance, which is the deliberate decision not to close an institution you know is broken. The regulator had a straightforward reason. The insurance fund did not have the money to pay off the depositors of every insolvent thrift. Closing them would have exhausted the fund and required an appropriation from Congress that Congress did not want to make. So institutions that were known to be insolvent were allowed to keep operating and to keep gambling for years. The industry called them zombies. Every month a zombie stayed open. It raised more insured deposits and made more desperate loans. Because for a firm with nothing left, the only rational strategy is to bet big. The estimated cost of resolving the crisis roughly quadrupled during the years of forbearance. Waiting did not make the problem smaller. Waiting was the single most expensive decision made. There is also the supervisory arithmetic, which is almost comic. The industry's assets grew enormously through the 1980s, while the number of federal examiners barely moved. Examiners were paid substantially less than the private sector and had, in many cases, no experience of commercial real estate lending, because thrifts had never done commercial real estate lending before. The people supervising a newly deregulated industry were trained to inspect mortgage files. Which brings us to the part everyone half remembers, the fraud. Charles Keating's Lincoln Savings and Loan is the emblematic case. He bought a California thrift in 1984, moved it aggressively into land development and junk bonds, and used it as a source of funds for his parent company. When regulators moved to restrict it, 5 United States senators, who had collectively received substantial campaign contributions from him, met with those regulators on his behalf. Lincoln failed in 1989 at a cost of over $3 billion. Around 23,000 people, many of them elderly, had bought bonds in Keating's parent company from tellers in the thrift's branches, in the reasonable belief that anything sold at a savings and loan counter was insured. It was not. They lost roughly $250 million. Keating went to prison. So did hundreds of others. There were more than 1,000 felony convictions arising from the crisis. But it is worth being precise here, because the fraud narrative is both true and misleading. Fraud was real, widespread, and criminal. It was also, on most estimates, a minority of the total loss. The larger share came from institutions that were structurally insolvent before anyone stole anything, run by people who were not criminals, making increasingly desperate bets because the alternative was to admit they were finished. Fraud is what the machine attracted. It is not what the machine was. If you build a structure where the downside belongs to the government and the upside belongs to whoever is holding the charter, you will draw in people who intend to exploit it. But you will also destroy a great many honest institutions, and the honest failures cost more in aggregate. The reckoning came in 1989. FIRREA, the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery and Enforcement Act, abolished the Federal Home Loan Bank Board and the insolvent FSLIC Insurance Fund. It created the Resolution Trust Corporation, whose job was to take over failed thrifts and dispose of their assets. The RTC eventually resolved 747 institutions, holding around $400 billion in assets. It became, briefly, one of the largest owners of real estate in the world, selling desert land and empty office towers into markets that had no buyers. The final accounting from the FDIC's own review put the total cost of resolving the crisis at roughly $160 billion, of which around $124 billion fell on taxpayers and the remainder on the industry itself. The estimate for closing the same institutions in 1982 had been about $25 billion. That is the price of the decision to wait, roughly 5 times, paid by people who had no part in any of it. So what is the mechanism, stated cleanly? An institution whose losses are guaranteed by someone else, and whose gains belong to itself, will take risks that no unguaranteed institution would take. That is not a moral failing. It is the correct response to the incentives, and any competent management will eventually arrive at it. The guarantee is not the error. Deposit insurance is genuinely valuable. It stops bank runs, and bank runs destroyed the American banking system repeatedly before it existed. The error is a guarantee without a corresponding constraint. Insurance normally comes with underwriting. The insurer inspects, prices the risk, and restricts behavior that would increase it. Federal deposit insurance in the 1980s did none of those things. It charged a flat premium regardless of risk, so a conservative thrift and a casino-owning one paid the same rate, which means the conservative institution was subsidizing the reckless one. Then deregulation removed the behavioral restrictions that had been standing in for underwriting. The guarantee stayed. Everything that made it safe was withdrawn. Which is why 2008 rhymes rather than repeats. The mechanism reappeared in a different form. Institutions that believed they were too large to be allowed to fail carried an implicit guarantee rather than an explicit one. And that implicit guarantee lowered their funding costs and encouraged exactly the leverage you would expect. Nobody had legislated it. It did not need legislating. A widely shared belief that the state will not permit a failure produces the same incentive as a written promise. The 2008 response also repeated the forbearance instinct, though for a shorter period, and the lesson from the 1980s that delay multiplies the bill was at least partly applied. There is a comparison worth making because it shows the counterfactual is real. The commercial banking system had serious problems in the same period, including a wave of failures and the near collapse of several large institutions. It did not produce anything on the scale of the thrift crisis. The differences were that banks had more diversified assets, faced tougher capital rules, and, critically, were not permitted the same accounting conventions. The thrift disaster was not an inevitable consequence of a hard decade. It was the consequence of a specific set of choices about accounting, capital, insurance, and supervision made in response to that decade. It is also worth saying what actually worked, since the story is usually told entirely as failure. Closing insolvent institutions promptly works. Every year of delay increased the cost, and the cost stopped increasing when closures began in earnest. Risk-based insurance premiums work and were introduced afterwards. Charging an institution for the risk it actually presents restores some of the discipline that a flat premium destroys. Prompt corrective action, a legal requirement that regulators intervene at defined capital thresholds, rather than exercising discretion about when to act, was legislated in 1991 precisely because discretion had been used to postpone every difficult decision. Those reforms came out of this crisis, and they are the reason the banking system handled the early 1990s better than it handled the 1980s. It is worth walking through a single institution in detail, because the aggregate numbers hide how the machine actually ran. Empire Savings and Loan of Mesquite, Texas is the cleanest example, partly because it failed early enough to be studied thoroughly. In 1982, it was a small, ordinary thrift with assets of around $17 million. 2 years later, it had assets of over $300 million. That is roughly a 20-fold increase in 24 months, achieved almost entirely through brokered deposits, money gathered nationally by brokers and placed in $100,000 blocks because Empire was paying the best advertised rate in the country. What did it do with the money? It financed condominium developments along Interstate 30 east of Dallas. The transactions involved land being sold repeatedly between related parties, each sale at a higher price than the last, with Empire lending against the newest and highest valuation. Nothing about that requires a buyer for a condominium. The profits were generated by the transactions themselves. Appraisals supported the prices because the appraisers were being paid by the people setting them, and each recorded sale became the comparable evidence justifying the next. When it was seized in 1984, examiners found thousands of condominium units, many unfinished, several never occupied at all. The eventual cost was around $300 million against an institution that 2 years earlier had been worth a rounding error. The thing to notice is that Empire did not need to break any law to grow 20-fold. Brokered deposits were legal. The new lending powers were legal. The appraisals were in a narrow sense defensible. Fraud charges followed, and convictions with them, but the growth itself was permitted. The structure allowed a small thrift in a Dallas suburb to raise $1/3 billion from strangers who had no reason to ask a single question, because the government had answered the only question that mattered. Now consider the depositor's position, because it is worth understanding how rational the behavior was on every side. You have $100,000. A thrift in a state you have never visited offers a rate 2 points above anything local. Your deposit is insured by the United States government to exactly that amount. There is no version of that decision in which you should investigate the institution. Investigating costs time and money and can produce no benefit, because your outcome is identical whether the thrift is prudent or reckless. If it survives, you are paid your interest. If it collapses, you are paid by the insurance fund. Depositors are, in the ordinary course, the most effective monitors a bank has. They are numerous, they are motivated, and they can withdraw instantly. Deposit insurance switched all of that off correctly, because the alternative is a bank run but completely. And once you have removed the monitors, the only thing standing between an institution and catastrophe is the regulator. Which is why the supervisory failures matter so much more than they otherwise would. Supervision was not one layer of defense among several. After 1980, it was the only one. There were people who saw it coming, and their treatment is instructive. Edwin Gray, appointed to chair the Federal Home Loan Bank Board in 1983, concluded within about a year that the deregulation was producing disaster and began trying to reverse parts of it, restricting direct investment, limiting brokered deposits, and asking for more examiners. He was opposed at nearly every turn. The industry lobbied against him with considerable success. His attempt to limit brokered deposits was struck down in court. His requests for examination staff ran into a federal hiring freeze and an administration committed to deregulation as a matter of principle. He was, by several accounts, regarded within his own government as an obstacle. By the time he left in 1987, the crisis was substantially beyond containment, and the recapitalization bill passed that year provided a fraction of what the insurance fund actually needed. The lesson there is not that someone should have listened to one man. It is that the political economy of this kind of failure is asymmetric. The costs of forbearance are diffuse, deferred and borne by taxpayers who are not yet aware they are involved. The costs of intervention are immediate, concentrated, and fall on an organized industry with representation in Congress. An official proposing to close hundreds of institutions in 1984 would have faced enormous, well-funded, immediate opposition in exchange for preventing a cost that had not yet materialized and therefore could not be proven. That asymmetry does not go away with better people. It is structural, and it is why rules that remove discretion, like the prompt corrective action requirements legislated afterwards, do more good than exhortations to be vigilant. There is also the question of what happened to the assets afterwards, which is less discussed and quite revealing. The Resolution Trust Corporation inherited a genuinely strange problem. It held enormous quantities of real estate in markets that its own sales were depressing. Selling quickly meant accepting very low prices and pushing prices lower still. Selling slowly meant carrying costs, deterioration, and the risk of political interference over years. It chose, broadly, to sell quickly, including through bulk sales and securitization of loan portfolios, packaging illiquid assets into tradable securities to attract buyers who would never have bought individual properties in Texas. That technique worked. It also seeded an industry. A number of the fortunes made in American real estate and distressed debt over the following 2 decades began with buyers acquiring RTC portfolios at deep discounts, and several of the structures developed to move those assets became standard practice in securitization. There is an uncomfortable symmetry in that. The tools built to clean up one crisis of mispriced risk went on to become instruments in the next one. It is also worth being clear about who ultimately paid, because the phrase "cost to the taxpayer" is doing a lot of work. The $124 billion was not a single appropriation. It was financed by borrowing through a purpose-built entity, with the interest payable over decades. The bonds issued to fund the cleanup were still being serviced into the 2020s. So the cost was not paid by the taxpayers of 1989 who might, at a stretch, be said to have elected the governments responsible. It was spread across taxpayers who were children at the time, or not born. Deferral was applied not only to recognizing the problem but to paying for it. That is worth sitting with, because deferral is the thread running through every stage of this story. Deferring recognition of insolvency in 1982, deferring closure through forbearance, deferring losses through regulatory accounting, deferring the bill itself through 30-year bonds. At every point the choice was between a cost now and a larger cost later, and at every point the later cost was chosen. There is one more comparison that makes the mechanism unmistakable. Not every country with deposit insurance had a savings and loan crisis. Insurance alone does not produce this outcome. What produced it was the specific combination: insurance that priced risk at zero, capital requirements that were lowered rather than raised as risk increased, accounting that permitted a whole to be recorded as an asset, supervision that was not resourced to match the powers being granted, and a political preference for delay. Remove any one of those and the crisis is smaller. Remove 2 or 3 and it is probably manageable. Which is the same shape as almost every institutional failure worth studying. It is rarely one decision. It is a set of individually defensible choices, each removing a safeguard that seemed redundant at the time, until there is nothing left between the institution and the outcome. There is one last detail that captures the whole thing. Deposit insurance was raised to $100,000 in 1980, and the industry that lobbied for it did so believing it would help them retain deposits in a period when they were losing them to money market funds. It was a defensive measure by institutions in trouble. It worked, deposits came back. And the mechanism by which they came back, depositors no longer needing to care whether the institution was sound, is precisely what allowed the worst institutions to grow the fastest and fail the largest. The rescue was the accelerant. Not through incompetence and not through malice, but because a guarantee that removes the need for scrutiny will always, eventually, be used by someone who does not want to be scrutinized. So the question worth asking of any financial institution is not how well it is run, or how sophisticated its risk management is. It is simpler, who bears the loss if this goes wrong, and does that same party have any power to stop it going wrong? When the answer to the first is the public and the answer to the second is no, everything else is detail, and the bill, whenever it arrives, will be larger than anybody's current estimate. There is a final thing worth saying about why this story stays obscure, because its obscurity is itself part of the pattern. It has no single day. The 1929 crash has a date, Black Monday has a date, Lehman has a weekend. The savings and loan crisis has a decade, which means there is no photograph, no moment, no footage of anyone shouting on a trading floor. It happened as a slow accumulation across thousands of small institutions, in places that television does not visit. It also has no single villain, despite Keating. The convictions ran into 4 figures precisely because the wrongdoing was distributed, and distributed wrongdoing does not produce a story anyone can tell in a headline. And the losses were socialized so smoothly that most of the people who paid them never knew. There was no moment at which a bill arrived. There was a bond issue, and 30 years of interest payments folded invisibly into the federal budget. A crisis with no date, no villain, and no visible bill is a crisis that produces no folk memory. Which is exactly why the same mechanism was available to be rebuilt, in a different form, within 20 years. The 1980s did not teach the lesson people assume it taught. It is generally remembered, when remembered at all, as a story about greed and crooked developers in Texas. That framing is comfortable because it locates the failure in individual character, which implies the fix is better people. The actual lesson is structural and much less comfortable. A guarantee with no underwriting attached will be exploited by whoever holds it, and the more precarious their position, the faster they will exploit it. That is a statement about incentives, not about morality, and it holds regardless of who is running the institution. Which means the defense has to be structural too. Price the guarantee, restrict the behavior of anyone holding it, resource the supervision to match the powers granted, and remove the discretion to postpone, because discretion under political pressure will always be used to postpone. None of that is difficult to state. All of it is expensive and unpopular at exactly the moment it needs doing, which is when nothing appears to be wrong. One more thing about the people who were not institutions. The depositors were made whole. That was the entire point of the insurance, and it worked. No insured depositor lost a cent, which is a genuine success, and the reason the crisis produced no bank runs despite 1,000 failures. But there were 3 groups outside that protection, and they are largely absent from the accounts. The first are the uninsured. Deposits above $100,000 and money placed with affiliates rather than the insured entity were not covered. Lincoln's bondholders are the well-known case, but they were not alone. The second are the borrowers. When a thrift failed, its performing loans were sold on, and the new holder had no relationship with the borrower and no interest in flexibility. Small businesses that had been dealing with the same local institution for 20 years found their credit lines called by an entity in another state that regarded them as a line in a portfolio. The third are the towns. A great many of these institutions were the only meaningful lender in their area. Their disappearance removed local credit at the same moment. The regional economy was contracting, which is precisely when it was most needed. None of that appears in the $124 billion. That figure measures the cost of making depositors whole. It does not measure the cost of removing 1,000 lenders from communities that had no substitute for them. And that cost was real even though nobody ever wrote it down. Which is a small illustration of the larger habit running through all of this. What gets measured is what has to be paid in cash, and everything else is treated as though it did not happen. And there is a reason that habit is so durable, which is worth naming before we finish. A cost you have to pay in cash this year has a name, a line in a budget, and somebody whose job depends on defending it. A cost that lands on a town, or on a borrower, or on a taxpayer 30 years from now has none of those things. It has no advocate in the room at the moment the decision is taken. So the decision is made by the people in the room, using the numbers in front of them, and the numbers in front of them are the ones somebody was required to produce. That is not corruption, and it is not incompetence. It is what happens when a system measures some consequences and not others, and then asks people to weigh them against each other. The thrift crisis is usually filed as a story about deregulation. It is more accurate to file it as a story about measurement, about a decade in which the true cost of a decision was knowable, was not required to be stated, and therefore was not stated until it arrived as a bill that nobody in the original room ever had to sign. In 1987, one man was paid $550 million, not the value of his shareholding, not a company's profit. His personal compensation for 1 year of work at a firm where he was neither the chief executive nor a member of the board. It was more than his own employer reported in earnings that year. Adjusted forward, it is well over $1 billion in today's money, and it was paid to a man running a trading desk out of an office in Beverly Hills, 3,000 miles from Wall Street, who started work at 4:30 in the morning. 3 years later, he was in a federal courtroom pleading guilty to 6 felonies, facing a 10-year sentence, and the firm that paid him had ceased to exist. Michael Milken is usually filed under greed, the symbol of the 1980s, the man who financed the corporate raiders, the villain of a decade of hostile takeovers. And there is a version of this story that stops there, because it is satisfying and because a good deal of it is true. But that version misses what he actually did, and what he actually did is more interesting and more uncomfortable than the caricature. Because underneath the excess, there was a genuine financial insight. It was correct. It had been sitting in a published academic study for 20 years, and essentially nobody in American finance had acted on it. Milken read it, believed it, and built an entire market on top of it. In the next 45 minutes, I want to take that apart properly. You will see the study, a 1958 book of bond statistics almost nobody outside universities had opened. You will see why it mattered, which requires understanding what a credit rating actually is and what it is not. You will see the market he built from it, and the companies that exist today because of it, several of which you use. Then you will see the turn, which is the part that matters most, how a mechanism for financing companies that could not otherwise borrow became the mechanism for buying companies against their will. You will see the one-page letter that made a small raider as dangerous as a large corporation. And you will see the collapse, the prosecution, and the 6 counts he actually pleaded to, which are not the crimes most people assume, and that gap is worth sitting with. Start with the rating, because everything here depends on it. When a company borrows by issuing a bond, agencies assess how likely it is to pay the money back and assign a grade. The scale runs from the top, AAA, reserved for the most secure borrowers on Earth, down through a long ladder of descending confidence. And somewhere in the middle of that ladder there is a line. Above it, a bond is investment grade. Below it, the bond is speculative, or, in the language of the trading floor, junk. That line is not a law of nature. It is a convention, but it acquired enormous power because it got written into rules. Pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and trustees operated under regulations and mandates that permitted them to hold investment-grade paper and prohibited or discouraged anything below it. The prohibition was not a judgment made by each institution about each bond. It was a category rule applied to everything under the line at once. Now consider what that meant in practice for a company. In the 1970s, the number of American corporations carrying an investment-grade rating was startlingly small, a few hundred, out of many thousands of substantial businesses. Everyone else, including profitable companies with real assets and real customers, sat below the line. And below the line, the public bond market was effectively closed, not expensive, closed. If you were not investment grade, you did not issue bonds, because the institutions that bought bonds were not permitted to buy yours. So those companies borrowed from banks, on the bank's terms, in amounts the bank chose, with covenants the bank wrote, and if the bank changed its mind about your industry, you were finished. The alternative was selling equity, which meant giving away ownership permanently to raise money temporarily. That was the structure of American corporate credit. A small elite could borrow cheaply from the entire investing public. Everyone else was a supplicant at a bank. And here is the thing about that line. Nobody had ever seriously tested whether it was drawn in the right place. Which brings us to a book almost nobody read. In 1958, an economist named W. Braddock Hickman published a study for the National Bureau of Economic Research titled Corporate Bond Quality and Investor Experience. It was a work of statistics, not advocacy. Hickman had assembled data on American corporate bonds across several decades, covering the boom of the 1920s, the Depression, and the recovery, the most brutal testing period imaginable for corporate credit. His question was simple. If you had bought low-rated bonds and held them, how would you actually have done, not in theory, but in realized returns after every default, every bankruptcy, and every loss was accounted for? The answer was not what the market structure implied. Low-grade bonds did default more often, substantially more often. But they also paid substantially more interest. And when Hickman worked through the arithmetic, the extra interest on a diversified portfolio of low-grade bonds more than compensated for the losses. Over his study period, a spread of low-rated bonds delivered returns that compared well against high-grade portfolios, and in stretches beat them outright. The finding is less shocking than it first sounds, and that is exactly why it is powerful. The market was pricing low-grade bonds as if they were nearly untouchable, because the institutions that set prices were legally or professionally barred from touching them. When the largest buyers are excluded from an asset by rule rather than by judgment, the remaining buyers get to set the price, and that price will tend to be too low. Hickman had not discovered that junk bonds were safe. He had measured that they were mispriced. Those are entirely different claims, and the difference is the whole story. The study sat there for 2 decades. It was cited in academic work. It did not change how anybody invested, for the straightforward reason that the people who could have acted on it were the people forbidden to. Then a graduate student read it. Michael Milken encountered Hickman's work as a student, first at Berkeley, then at Wharton, and he took from it something more specific than an investment idea. He took a conviction that the rating system was measuring the wrong thing. A rating is a probability of default. It is not a statement about return, because return depends on the price you pay. A bond with a 1 in 10 chance of default is a terrible investment at one price and an excellent one at another, and the rating alone cannot tell you which. The market had collapsed those 2 questions into one, and the collapse created the opportunity. Milken joined Drexel Firestone in 1970, a firm that would become Drexel Burnham Lambert, and which at the time was nobody's idea of a powerhouse. He began trading low-grade bonds, and initially the bonds he traded were what the market called fallen angels. A fallen angel is a bond that was investment grade when issued and has since been downgraded. The company ran into trouble, the rating dropped below the line, and the institutions holding it were suddenly obliged to sell. Not because they had re-examined the company, because a rule required it. That is a forced seller, and forced selling is the most reliable source of mispricing in finance. The seller is not weighing value against price, they are complying. Milken bought from them. To do that with any confidence, you have to actually know the company, its assets, its cash flows, whether it can survive. And this is the part of the story that is usually skipped. Milken worked obsessively. He read the filings nobody read. He built a knowledge of hundreds of marginal companies that essentially no one else on Wall Street possessed, because no one else had a reason to acquire it. The bonds were untouchable, so why study them? It is worth pausing on how that operation physically worked, because it explains a great deal about what followed. In 1978, Milken moved his department from New York to Beverly Hills. The stated reason was family, but the effect was operational. Working on Pacific time meant that when the New York market opened at 6:30 in the morning his time, he had already been at his desk for 2 hours. He began at 4:30. Colleagues describe a man who was on the telephone essentially continuously for the entire trading day. The desk itself became famous, an X-shaped configuration with Milken at the center, so that he sat within earshot of every trader and every conversation. There was no private office and no door. Information about who wanted what flowed to one point, and that point was him. And this is the thing that made the network work. He was not merely a trader with good judgment about bonds. He was the person who knew at any moment which institution had cash to deploy, which was under pressure to sell, which fund manager would take a particular kind of risk, and what each of them owned. That knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived in one man's head, and it could not be replicated by a competitor without spending a decade building it. Which is also why it was so dangerous. A market whose liquidity depends on one person's recall and relationships is a market with a single point of failure. For as long as he was at the center of it, everything cleared. The question nobody asked until 1990 was what the market would look like on a day when he was not there. By the mid-1970s, he was running a highly profitable operation inside Drexel, and he had something more valuable than the profits, a network of buyers. He had found the institutions and individuals who were willing to hold this paper, and he knew what each of them wanted. When he needed to place bonds, he knew exactly whom to call. And then he made the leap that created everything that followed. If a downgraded bond could be bought and sold at a sensible price, why did a bond have to start life investment grade at all? Why not simply issue new bonds, original issue, from companies that had never been rated highly and never would be, and sell them at a yield that honestly reflected the risk? Put that way, it sounds obvious. It was not. It required a buyer base willing to purchase speculative paper at issue, and that buyer base did not exist until somebody assembled it. Milken had spent years assembling it. From the late 1970s, Drexel began underwriting original issue high-yield bonds, and the effect on American corporate finance was genuinely transformative. Consider what it meant for a company. Before, if you were not one of a few hundred blue chips, your growth was rationed by what a bank would lend you. After, you could raise money directly from the public markets, in size, on terms you negotiated, provided you were willing to pay a rate that reflected what you were. The companies that used this are not obscure. MCI Communications was attempting to compete with AT&T, a regulated monopoly of vast size, and needed enormous capital to build a network. No bank was going to fund that. Through Drexel, MCI raised well over $1 billion in high-yield debt, and the competition it created helped break the monopoly. Ted Turner used high-yield financing in building his television business, including the launch and survival of a 24-hour news channel that everybody in the industry considered a certain failure. Craig McCaw built a cellular telephone business on it at a time when mobile phones were a curiosity, and eventually sold it to AT&T for many billions. Cable television, an industry requiring vast upfront construction against distant revenues, was substantially financed this way. That is the case for the defense, and it is not a small one. A financial innovation that lets a well-run company with no pedigree raise $1 billion to attack a monopoly is not a trick. It is capital allocation working better than it had before. For roughly a decade, that was the business, and if the story ended there, Milken would be in textbooks as a straightforward financial innovator. Then the same instrument was pointed at a different target. Here is the mechanism, and it follows directly from what came before. If a bond can raise $1 billion to build a telephone network, it can raise $1 billion to buy an existing company. The money does not know what it is for. The leveraged buyout works like this. You identify a company whose assets or cash flows are worth more than its share price suggests. You borrow the great majority of the purchase price. You buy the company. And then, this is the essential part. The debt you used to buy it is placed onto the company itself. The acquired business now services the loan that bought it. If it works, the returns to the small sliver of equity are extraordinary, because leverage multiplies gains. If it fails, the company carries a debt load it cannot support, and what follows is asset sales, job losses, or bankruptcy. Before high-yield bonds, the scale of such a deal was capped by how much a bank syndicate would lend. High-yield bonds removed the cap. Suddenly, a buyer with modest resources could assemble a bid for a company many times their size, because the money came from the public market rather than from a lending committee. Put some numbers on it, because the abstraction hides what is actually happening. Imagine a company with a share price valuing it at $1 billion. It is unexciting but solid. It generates $200 million a year in operating cash flow. It carries little debt, and its management has been running it comfortably for years. A buyer offers $1.3 billion, a premium the shareholders are delighted to accept. Of that, perhaps $150 million is the buyer's own equity. The remaining $1.15 billion is borrowed, much of it in high-yield bonds paying, say, 14%. The deal completes, and now the debt sits on the company. Interest alone runs to something like $160 million a year against operating cash flow of $200 million. Before this transaction, the company had comfortable cover and choices. Now it has $40 million of headroom and a schedule. Everything follows from that arithmetic. Marginal factories close, because the cash they consume is now needed for interest. Research budgets are cut, because research pays back over 10 years and the coupon is due in 6 months. Divisions are sold, because a division that fetches $300 million retires debt immediately. Headcount falls. But notice where the money came from. Some of it genuinely came from running the business better, because a management team with a debt schedule cannot afford the comfortable inefficiency it previously tolerated. That is the honest defense of the leveraged buyout, and it is not nothing. And some of it came from things that were not efficiencies at all. It came from wages that were not paid, plants that were not maintained, research that was not funded, and pension arrangements that were renegotiated. It also came from existing bondholders, whose safe bonds in an unlevered company became risky bonds in a heavily indebted one overnight, without their consent and without compensation. The two sources look identical on a spreadsheet. Both show up as improved returns to equity. Distinguishing them requires looking at the company 5 years later, which is precisely what nobody involved in the transaction was paid to do. The best documented case is the buyout of the Safeway supermarket chain in 1986. The deal was financially successful, and its defenders can point to real operational improvements. It also involved tens of thousands of employees losing jobs as stores and divisions were sold or closed, and a Wall Street Journal investigation into the human consequences won a Pulitzer Prize in 1990. Both of those statements are true simultaneously, and any account that gives you only one of them is selling something. That changed the balance of power in corporate America completely, and it did so almost overnight. For decades, the largest American corporations had been effectively immune to being bought. Their size was their protection. Nobody could raise enough to take them over. Their managements answered to boards frequently populated by friends, and to shareholders who had no practical means of forcing change. Now anybody with a credible plan and Drexel's phone number was a potential threat to any company in the country. The people who did this became known as corporate raiders, and their argument was that they were disciplining complacent managements who had grown fat on shareholders' money. Their critics argued they were asset strippers loading sound companies with debt to extract a fee. Both descriptions fit different deals, and the honest position is that the same mechanism produced both outcomes depending on who was using it and what they did afterwards. It is worth naming a few of them, because the abstraction of the raiders hides how different the outcomes were. T. Boone Pickens ran a modest oil company in Texas and made his name pursuing companies many times its size, most famously Gulf Oil. He did not win that one. What happened instead is instructive. Gulf, to escape him, sold itself to Chevron in what was then the largest merger in American history. Pickens and his investors made a very large profit without ever acquiring anything. He argued with some force that oil company executives were sitting on reserves worth more than their share prices and doing nothing about it, and that shareholders were entitled to that value. His critics noted that he was paid handsomely, whether or not any oil was ever produced. Carl Icahn is the case that cuts the other way, and it is the one worth knowing in detail. In 1985, he acquired TWA, at that point one of the great names in American aviation. The airline was taken private, and the debt from the acquisition was placed on it. To service that debt, assets were sold, including, in 1991, TWA's prized London routes, which went to American Airlines. Selling the most profitable routes to a competitor solves this year's interest payment and removes next year's earnings. TWA entered bankruptcy in 1992, again in 1995, and a third time in 2001, when what remained was bought by American. Icahn personally did well out of the arrangement. The airline did not survive. Those two cases bracket the argument. In one, the threat of a takeover forced a complacent board to surface value it had been ignoring, and shareholders benefited without the raider ever taking control. In the other, a functioning company was acquired, loaded with debt, stripped of its best assets to service that debt, and ultimately destroyed. The mechanism was identical in both. What differed was what the buyer did next, and nothing in the financing structure distinguished between them at the time the money was raised. A bond issue does not know whether the debt it creates will discipline a lazy management or dismember a sound company. It simply funds whoever is willing to pay the coupon. That is why the argument has never been settled. Defenders point at Gulf and at the genuine sloth of many American boardrooms in the 1970s, which was real. Critics point at TWA and at the towns that lost employers, which is also real. Both are describing the same decade accurately. They are simply looking at different deals. And then Drexel introduced a piece of paper that made the threat real before a single dollar had been raised. It was called a highly confident letter, and it was about a page long. In it, Drexel stated that it was highly confident it could raise the financing required for a proposed acquisition. It was not a guarantee. It committed no capital. It was, in legal terms, close to worthless. It was also devastating because everybody knew Drexel could do it. The letter converted Milken's placement network into a weapon that could be deployed instantly. A raider no longer needed committed financing to launch a bid. He needed a letter, and the target's board had to treat the bid as real. Think about what that does to a boardroom. A company receives an approach from a buyer with a fraction of its resources and cannot dismiss it because attached is a page from a Beverly Hills trading desk. The board must respond, defend, find another buyer, take on debt themselves to make the company unattractive, or accept. An enormous amount of the corporate restructuring of the 1980s traces back to that single page. And underpinning it was the network, which is where the story starts to darken. Drexel held an annual conference in Beverly Hills for high-yield issuers and investors. Officially, it was the High Yield Bond Conference. It became known as the Predator's Ball, and that name, the title of Connie Bruck's 1988 book, stuck because it captured something real. In one place, once a year, sat the people who issued this debt and the people who bought it, and the man who connected them. The concern about that arrangement is not complicated. When a market's buyers and sellers are substantially assembled by one intermediary, prices in it are not independent evidence of value. If the same network buys your bonds and you buy theirs, and the connector arranges both, then the market price is partly a fact about the network rather than about the companies. There is no need to allege conspiracy to see the problem. A closed circle can produce prices that look like a market and are not one, and everyone inside can be acting in good faith. By 1986, the high-yield market had grown from almost nothing to a couple of $100 billion. Drexel had risen from an also-ran to one of the most profitable firms on Wall Street, and Milken's operation generated a large share of it. The takeover wave was reaching companies once thought untouchable, culminating in a fight for RJR Nabisco that ran past $25 billion and became the defining deal of the era. That last deal deserves a moment because it is where the decade turns. RJR Nabisco was a tobacco and food conglomerate, Camel cigarettes and Oreo biscuits under one roof, and in 1988 its own chief executive proposed to take it private, buying it from its shareholders with borrowed money. What he had not anticipated was that announcing such a plan is an invitation. Once a company is formally in play, anyone may bid. What followed was a bidding contest conducted at a speed and scale nobody had seen, and it ended with the buyout firm KKR acquiring the company for roughly $25 billion, the largest takeover in history at that point, and a record that stood for years. Two details are worth carrying away. The first is that the winning bid was assembled in days rather than months, which was only possible because the high-yield market had been built to move that fast. The second is that Drexel was not the victor. Milken's firm participated on the losing side, and the deal was won by a rival with bank financing and its own access to the bond market. That second point is the one people miss. By 1988, the mechanism had escaped its inventor. Other banks had learned to underwrite this paper. Other buyers had learned to hold it, and a takeover of unprecedented size could be financed without the Beverly Hills desk being decisive. The market Milken created had grown larger than the man at its center, which mattered enormously for what happened next, because a market that no longer depended on him could survive him, and the firm that did depend on him could not. At which point the government arrived. The unraveling did not begin with Milken. It began with Ivan Boesky, an arbitrageur who speculated on takeovers and who had been trading on information he was not entitled to have. In November 1986, Boesky settled with the Securities and Exchange Commission, paying $100 million and accepting a bar from the industry. What mattered more was the rest of the arrangement. He cooperated, and he had been permitted to sell holdings before the announcement, which itself caused outrage when it emerged. Boesky's cooperation pointed at Drexel and at Milken. The relationship at issue involved practices with a technical sound and serious legal consequences. arrangements in which one party held securities for another to disguise ownership, and accounts were settled through invoices for services that masked the true nature of the transactions. That is what the case was actually about. It is worth stating plainly because it differs from the popular memory, in which Milken is a straightforward insider trader. In 1988, prosecutors made clear they were prepared to charge Drexel itself under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, a statute written for organized crime. The significance of RICO here is not the sentence. It is what an indictment did to a securities firm before any trial. RICO permitted the government to seek forfeiture of assets pre-trial. A financial institution depends entirely on counterparties being willing to face it. A firm whose assets might be frozen is a firm nobody will trade with. An indictment was therefore close to a death sentence, regardless of guilt. This is a genuine issue about prosecutorial power, and it should be acknowledged whatever you think of the defendants. Faced with a charge that could destroy the firm before a jury heard anything, Drexel did what any firm would. In December 1988, it agreed to plead guilty to 6 felonies and to pay $650 million, the largest securities penalty in history at that point. And it agreed to cooperate against Milken. He was indicted in March 1989 on a very large number of counts. In April 1990, he pleaded guilty to 6. And this is the part I most want to be precise about, because it is almost always reported wrongly. The 6 counts were securities and tax offenses arising from the Boesky relationship and related dealings, assisting in the filing of false documents, mail fraud, conspiracy, and helping to file a false tax return. Insider trading, the crime most people associate with him, was not among them. That is not a technicality, and it is not an exoneration. He admitted to serious federal felonies, and the conduct involved deceiving regulators and the market about who owned what. But it is materially different from the popular account, and the difference matters when we assess the sentence. In November 1990, Judge Kimba sentenced him to 10 years, far longer than most observers expected for the counts he had admitted, and widely read at the time as a sentence for a decade rather than for 6 offenses. He served about 22 months. The sentence was later reduced in recognition of his cooperation. In total, he paid roughly $600 million in fines and settlements, and he was barred from the securities industry for life. Drexel Burnham Lambert did not survive. Weakened by the fine, deprived of the operation that generated its profits, and shut out of funding markets, it filed for bankruptcy in February 1990. A firm that had been among the most profitable in America was gone within about 14 months of the plea. And the market he built, it fell hard, then it recovered, and it never went away. The high-yield market seized in 1989 and 1990. Defaults climbed as deals financed at the peak failed. Thrifts were forced by new legislation to dump their holdings into a market with no buyers, which drove prices down further. A story this channel has told in its own right, and the reason the 2 episodes are connected but not the same. The seizure is worth describing properly, because it shows how a market with one center actually fails. Through 1989, the deals had been getting more aggressive and the cushions thinner. In September, Campo Corporation, which had bought 2 large American department store groups with enormous quantities of borrowed money, ran short of cash. The news that a marquee high-yield borrower could not meet its obligations moved the whole market at once, because investors who had been treating these bonds as a category rather than as individual credits now re-rated the entire category, exactly as they had done in the opposite direction on the way up. In October, a proposed employee-led buyout of United Airlines collapsed when its banks would not provide the financing. The stock market fell sharply on the news in a single afternoon. The signal was unmistakable. The money that had made any deal possible was no longer automatically available. And then the buyers disappeared, which is the part that matters. For a decade, an investor wanting to sell high-yield bonds could call Milken's desk and get a price, because he knew who wanted them. With Drexel under indictment, that desk was no longer a reliable counterparty, and by 1990 it was gone entirely. The bonds still existed. The companies still paid their coupons. But the mechanism that turned a bond into cash on demand had been a network centered on one firm, and when the firm failed, the network did not transfer to anyone else. Legislation compounded it. New rules following the savings and loan crisis required thrifts to divest their high-yield holdings, forcing a large body of sellers into a market that had lost its principal buyer. That is a story this channel has told in its own right, and it is the point where these two episodes touch. But the S&L collapse had many causes of its own, and junk bonds were one line in a much longer bill. Prices fell far below anything defaults justified, which is the signature of a liquidity failure rather than a credit one. Investors who could hold through it did well. Investors who had to sell did not. Yet the instrument itself was sound, and the proof is that it is entirely normal today. The high-yield market is a permanent, enormous part of global corporate finance. Companies below investment grade routinely raise money in it. There are index funds for it. The idea that a company's credit rating determines the price of its debt, rather than its right to issue any at all, is now simply how finance works. That is the strangest part of the legacy. The mechanism was vindicated completely. It was the concentration around it that failed. But before scoring the man, there is a question about the founding insight that deserves a straight answer. Was Hickman actually right about the bonds Milken went on to create? This matters more than it might sound, because the two things are not the same. Hickman had measured fallen angels, bonds issued by established companies that were downgraded later. Milken's great innovation was original issue high yield, bonds sold as speculative from the first day to companies that had never been anything else. The evidence for the first was being used to justify the second, and that is a genuine logical gap. There are reasons to think the gap is real. A fallen angel is a company that was once good enough to earn an investment-grade rating and has stumbled. It has a history, established assets, and often a plausible route back. A company that was never investment-grade at all may be a fine business with a short record, or it may be a business that has never been able to demonstrate it can survive a downturn. Those are different populations, and Hickman had studied one of them. There is also a selection problem in the timing. Through most of the 1980s, the American economy grew and interest rates fell, which is close to ideal weather for a borrower carrying a large amount of debt. A strategy that performs well in those conditions has not yet been tested. It has merely not yet been tested. The market's real examination arrived in 1989 and 1990, and the results were considerably worse than the promotional material had implied. Academic work on this ran for years afterwards. Edward Altman, whose research on corporate default became the standard reference, found default rates on 1980s issuance that were substantially higher than the early sales pitch suggested. Particularly, once you measured defaults against the year, a bond was issued rather than against the size of a market that was growing rapidly, which flatters the numbers by comparing this year's defaults to a much larger denominator. The fairest summary is this. The core insight that a category rule was excluding an entire class of borrower and that the exclusion created a mispricing was correct, and it has been vindicated permanently by the market that exists today. The stronger claim that a diversified portfolio of newly issued speculative bonds was reliably a superior investment, was oversold during the boom, and did not survive the test of a recession, which is a fairly ordinary pattern in finance. A true observation gets turned into a marketing claim. The marketing claim outruns the evidence, and the correction falls on whoever bought last. So how should we actually score this? Start with what is genuinely to his credit. The insight was real, it was correct, and it had been available in a published study for 20 years while the whole of American finance ignored it. He democratized access to credit for companies that had been locked out by a rule that mistook a category for an analysis. Businesses exist because of it, in telecommunications, in cable, in cellular, that would otherwise have been strangled by their inability to borrow. Now the other side. The same instrument pointed at takeovers, imposed real costs on real people, and the arithmetic of a leveraged buyout is unsentimental. Debt service comes first, and it is paid from cash flow that would otherwise have gone to wages, investment, or slack. Some of those deals genuinely improved badly run companies. Others transferred value from employees and bondholders to a small group of buyers and their advisors, and left the business weaker. And there is the concentration. A market where one desk connects most of the issuers to most of the buyers is not the neutral price discovery that the case for high-yield debt depends on. The intellectual argument for these bonds was that the market had mispriced them. It is hard to sustain that argument when the market has become, in significant part, one man's phone list. Then the conduct which he admitted. Not the crime of the caricature, but real offenses involving deception about ownership and false filings, committed by someone who did not need to commit them, which is the detail I find hardest to explain. He was the most successful financier in America. The conduct he pleaded to concerned relatively marginal advantages. He was pardoned by the president in February 2020, 30 years after the plea. He had by then spent decades in medical philanthropy, following his own cancer diagnosis, and the institute bearing his name had become a fixture of economic conferences. Here is the thought I am left with, and it is not really about him. His insight was that a rule intended as a safeguard had become a barrier, that below investment grade had stopped meaning risky and started meaning forbidden, and that the gap between those two words was worth a fortune. He was right. He found that gap and he was paid enormously for it. But the reason the gap existed was that the rule was doing something useful for the institutions bound by it. Pension funds were restricted from speculative debt because pension funds hold other people's retirements. An accrued rule that a trustee cannot argue their way around has real value precisely because it is crude. Milken proved the rule was costing companies money. He did not prove it was costing them more than it saved. And when the barrier came down, what flowed through it was not only capital for entrepreneurs who could not otherwise borrow. It was also the ability to borrow against a company in order to buy it. Both of those came through the same opening. Nobody found a way to admit one and not the other, and nobody has since. At 9:30 on the morning of the 1st of August, 2012, the opening bell rang on the New York Stock Exchange, and a company that had been in business for 17 years began to destroy itself at a rate of roughly $10 million a minute. It took 45 minutes. By the time the trading was stopped, Knight Capital Group had lost $440 million, more than its entire profit for the previous 2 years, and more than the company was worth. Within a week, it had surrendered 3/4 of its equity to a rescue consortium. Within 5 months, the firm no longer existed. Nobody stole anything. There was no fraud, no rogue trader, no bad bet on the direction of a market. Not one person at Knight Capital made a decision that morning that lost money. There was no market event either. The 1st of August 2012 was an unremarkable Wednesday. The indices barely moved, no central bank spoke, no company of consequence reported. The conditions that destroyed Knight Capital were entirely internal, and they had been in place, unnoticed and harmless, for 7 years. What happened was that a piece of software did exactly what it had been written to do 9 years earlier. In a part of the system, everyone had forgotten was still there. This is a story about dead code, and it is the closest thing modern finance has to a pure laboratory experiment. Every other disaster in this series involves human judgment, greed, optimism, self-deception, the ordinary machinery of people talking themselves into things. Strip all of that out and you can still lose $500 million before lunch, because the machinery that moves money is now written in software, and software does not know what year it is. Start with what Knight Capital actually was, because it is not a household name and it should be. Knight was a market maker. Specifically, it was the largest retail market maker in the United States. If you bought 100 shares of Apple in 2012 through an ordinary brokerage account, there is a very good chance that the shares you received came from Knight, and that the transaction never touched a stock exchange at all. That business is worth understanding, because it explains the scale of what followed. When a small investor places an order, the broker does not usually send it to an exchange. It sells the order flow to a wholesale market maker, who fills it directly from their own inventory. The market maker quotes a price to buy and a price to sell, and the gap between the two, the spread, is the profit. On any single trade, it is a fraction of a cent. Across 100 million trades a day, it is a business. Knight handled something in the region of 10% of all U.S. equity trading volume, and a substantially higher share of retail volume. On a normal day, it traded around $20 billion worth of stock. It was, in the most literal sense, part of the plumbing, invisible, unglamorous, and load-bearing. Now the specific event that set the timer, because none of this happens without a deadline. In 2012, the New York Stock Exchange launched something called the Retail Liquidity Program. The idea was straightforward. The NYSE had been losing retail order flow to wholesalers exactly like Knight, and it wanted some of it back. The program allowed exchange members to offer retail investors a small price improvement, a fraction of a cent better than the publicly quoted price, in order to attract those orders onto the exchange. The Securities and Exchange Commission approved it for launch on the 1st of August, 2012. For firms like Knight, participation was not really optional. If the NYSE was going to offer retail price improvement, a wholesaler that could not interact with that program would be at a disadvantage. So Knight had to build software to handle the new order type, and it had roughly a month to do it. That is the whole setup. A regulatory change, a fixed go-live date, a compressed development window, and a firm that could not afford to sit it out. Nothing about that is unusual. It is how most software in most industries gets built. Now the system itself, and this is where the story becomes specific. Knight's orders were handled by a program called SMARS, the Smart Market Access Routing System. Its job was to take a large order from a client, break it into smaller pieces, and route those pieces to wherever they could be filled. A parent order comes in, many child orders go out. As child orders are filled, SMARS keeps a running tally and stops sending more once the parent order is complete. That last part is the important one. The counter is what makes the system safe. Without it, a router would keep sending orders forever. Buried inside SMARS was a function called Power Peg. Power Peg was old. It had been written in the late 1990s and used until around 2003, when it was retired. It was a testing tool. Its purpose was to move a stock's price by deliberately buying high and selling low, so that other parts of the system could be tested against price movement. It was never intended for live trading, and it had not been used in 9 years. It had also, crucially, not been deleted. It sat in the codebase, unreachable, dormant, waiting for a flag that nobody was going to set. And in 2005, something happened that turned a dormant function into a loaded weapon. In 2005, Knight's developers moved the counting logic, the part that tracks how much of a parent order has been filled and tells the system to stop, out of the individual routing strategies and into a shared, higher-level part of SMARS. It was a sensible refactor. The counter now lived in one place instead of many. But PowerPeg was not updated to use the new shared counter. It did not need to be, because PowerPeg was dead. Nobody was going to call it. The result was a function that, if it ever ran, would buy and sell without any mechanism to tell it to stop. Not a bug in the sense of a mistake in logic. PowerPeg worked precisely as designed. What had changed was that the thing which used to stop it no longer applied to it, and nobody checked, because checking dead code is not something anyone does. This is worth stating plainly, because it is the heart of the case. The lethal condition was created in 2005 by a routine improvement, and it sat there harmlessly for 7 years. There was no moment at which anyone could have looked at the system and seen a problem, because there was no problem until somebody set a flag. Now the flag, and this is the decision that turned 7 years of dormant risk into 45 minutes of catastrophe. The new retail liquidity program code needed a way to be switched on. Rather than create a new flag, the developers reused an existing one, the flag that had once activated PowerPeg. It was available. It was doing nothing. Reusing it saved a small amount of work. So the code base now contained a single switch with 2 meanings. In the new code, it meant run the RLP logic. In the old forgotten code, it still meant run PowerPeg. The deployment took place over the last week of July 2012. Knight ran SMARS across 8 servers. A technician copied the new code to each of them. 7 servers received it, 1 did not. Nobody noticed. There was no second person reviewing the deployment, no automated verification that all 8 machines were running the same version, and no alert when they were not. The SEC's later order was blunt about this. Knight had no written procedures requiring a review of the deployment and no supervisory process to catch what had happened. So on the morning of the 1st of August, 7 of Knight's 8 routing servers were running new code that would interpret the flag as do RLP. One was running 9-year-old code that would interpret it as run PowerPeg and do not stop. There was one more warning, and it arrived before the market opened. At around 8 o'clock that morning, roughly 90 minutes before the bell, Knight's systems began generating automated email alerts. 60-odd of them went out to a group of employees, referencing errors relating to an order routing component, the code with the reused flag. They flagged that something was wrong with SMARS on the pre-market orders. The emails were not designed as an alert system. They were system-generated messages of a kind that arrived routinely, addressed to a distribution list, with no requirement that anyone act on them and no escalation path. Nobody investigated before the open. That is not laziness. It is what happens when a genuine warning arrives through a channel that produces mostly noise. Every organization with automated monitoring has this problem. An alert that fires often enough to be ignored is functionally the same as no alert at all. At 9:30, the market opened, and orders started flowing into SMARS. 7 servers did the right thing. The 8th received its share of the orders and called Power Peg. Power Peg did what it was built to do. It bought at the offer and sold at the bid, the opposite of how a market maker makes money. And because its stop counter had been orphaned in 2005, it did not stop. It filled a child order, registered nothing, and sent another, and another. In 45 minutes, that single server processed a little over 200 parent orders into more than 4 million child orders, executing over 390 million shares across 154 stocks. To put that in perspective, Knight accumulated a net long position of around $3.5 billion in 80 stocks, and a net short position of around $3.5 billion in another 74. It was, in under an hour, holding roughly $7 billion of unwanted positions built at deliberately unfavorable prices. The effect on the market was immediately visible from outside. Stocks began moving in ways that made no sense, sharp, sustained, volume-heavy moves with no news behind them. Traders watching the tape could see something was badly wrong within minutes. What they could not tell was what or whose. And here the story turns from an accident into something closer to tragedy, because of what Knight's staff did next. They knew quickly that the problem was in the new code. That was the obvious inference. New deployment, immediate chaos. So they responded in the way that would ordinarily be correct. They rolled back the new code, removing it from the 7 servers where it had been installed, which meant that all 8 servers were now running the old code. All 8 now interpreted the flag as Run Power Peg. For a period, the response made the situation dramatically worse. The one thing that had been limiting the damage was that 7/8 of the order flow was being handled correctly. Removing the new code removed that protection. It is a genuinely cruel detail. The instinct undo the change is right almost every time. Here it was catastrophically wrong, and the reason is that the actual fault was not in the new code at all. It was in the old code that the new code had been masking. It took roughly 45 minutes from the opening bell to stop the trading entirely, which required shutting down the routing system. The arithmetic afterwards was brutal and quick. Knight held around $7 billion of positions it did not want, acquired at prices deliberately worse than the market. It had nothing like the capital to hold them. Over that day and the next, working with Goldman Sachs, it liquidated the book at a realized loss of approximately $440 million. For context, Knight's total pre-tax earnings in 2011 had been in the region of $115 million. 45 minutes had consumed something close to 4 years of profit. The firm's regulatory capital was gone. A broker-dealer that falls below its capital requirement cannot trade, and a market maker that cannot trade has no business. Knight had at most a weekend. What followed was one of the faster rescues in Wall Street history. Over the weekend of the 4th and 5th of August, a consortium, Jefferies, Blackstone, TD Ameritrade, Getco, and others, put together $400 million of convertible preferred stock. It closed on the 6th. The terms were what you would expect from investors negotiating with a firm that had no alternative. The conversion effectively handed the consortium around 73% of the company. Knight's shareholders, who had owned a profitable market maker on Tuesday, owned roughly a quarter of it by Monday. The firm survived in name for a few more months. In December 2012, it agreed to merge with Getco, one of its rescuers. The combined company became KCG Holdings in July 2013, and KCG was itself bought by Virtu Financial in 2017. The Knight Capital Group that opened for business on the 1st of August 2012 does not exist. The SEC's enforcement action, settled in 2013 for $12 million, is worth reading because it is less interested in the accident than in what made the accident possible. It found that Knight did not have adequate controls over the deployment of code to production. It found no requirement for a second person to review a deployment. It found that Knight had no automated system to check that all servers were running the same software version. It found that the firm's capital thresholds, the levels at which trading should be halted automatically, were set so high as to be meaningless, and in some cases were not connected to any automatic action at all. And it found that the email alerts had no defined escalation path. The charge was a violation of the market access rule, adopted in 2010, which requires broker-dealers with direct market access to maintain risk controls. The rule existed. Knight had signed off on compliance with it. The controls, in practice, were not there. Before the aftermath, it is worth asking the obvious question honestly. Could anyone reasonably have caught this? The satisfying answer is that a proper code review would have found it. That answer is mostly wrong, and it is worth understanding why, because it changes what you would actually do about it. Consider the 2005 refactor from the perspective of the developer doing it. The task is to move the fill tracking logic out of the individual routing strategies into a shared component. You identify every strategy in live use. You update each one, you test them. PowerPeg is not in live use. It has not been called in 2 years. It is not on the list because the list is strategies we run. A reviewer looking at that change sees a clean consolidation of duplicated logic across the active code paths. To flag the omission, they would have to ask, is there any code in this system that is currently unreachable, and would it still be correct if it ever became reachable again? That is not a question anyone asks in a code review. It is barely a coherent question, because the answer for dead code is always, it doesn't matter, it's dead. Now consider the 2012 developer choosing which flag to use for the new RLP feature. They need a free flag. They look for one that is not in use. They find one that is genuinely not in use. That is precisely why it is available. Reusing it is the obviously economical choice. And in a code base where flags are a finite resource, it is close to standard practice. Neither of those decisions is careless. Each is defensible on its own, made years apart by people who could not see the other. The failure only exists in the combination, and no individual review encounters the combination. This is the characteristic shape of a systems accident, and it is why the SEC's action focused on controls rather than on finding a culprit. The interesting question is not who erred. Nobody meaningfully did. The question is what stops an undetectable latent condition from reaching a $7 billion position, and the answer is never better reviewing. It is a limit downstream that does not care why the system is misbehaving. The one control that would unambiguously have caught it is the dullest imaginable, an automated check that all 8 servers are running the same build. That is not sophisticated engineering. It is a comparison of version numbers, and it would have flagged the discrepancy days before the launch. There is also a human cost that the case studies tend to skip. Knight employed around 1,400 people. Most of them worked in sales, technology, compliance, and operations, and had no connection whatever to the routing system. They arrived on Wednesday at a profitable, established firm, and by the following Monday they worked for a company 3/4 owned by outside investors, on its way to being absorbed. Thomas Joyce, the chief executive, spent the following days doing television interviews explaining what had happened, in the middle of negotiating for the firm's survival. He described the error, accurately and unusually bluntly, as a large bug, Not a hack, not a market event, not something done to them. He kept the firm alive through the weekend and lost it by Christmas anyway. The engineers involved were, by every account, competent professionals doing ordinary work under a regulatory deadline they had not chosen. The individual who missed the 8th server has never been publicly named, which is right, because naming them would suggest the accident was theirs. It was not. It was distributed across 7 years and dozens of reasonable decisions, and the deployment was simply where it surfaced. That distribution is worth sitting with, because it is what makes these events so hard to prevent. There is no moment in this story where somebody could have known enough to act. The information required to see the problem existed only in aggregate, across years, in places nobody had reason to look at together. There is a detail about the aftermath that decided whether Knight lived or died, and it turned on a rule most people have never heard of. When something goes obviously wrong in a market, exchanges can declare trades clearly erroneous and cancel them. If a stock trades at a price wildly away from its recent range because of an evident malfunction, the trades can be unwound and everyone put back where they started. Knight needed that badly. If the 4 million child orders could be voided, the losses largely disappear. They were not. The exchanges reviewed the affected securities and busted trades in only 6 of the 154 stocks. In the other 148, the prices had not moved far enough outside the permitted bands to qualify. Knight's algorithm had been buying at the offer and selling at the bid, aggressive, expensive, and continuous, but not producing the wild dislocations the rule was written to catch. That is a sharp irony. The very ordinariness of the prices, one trade at a time, is what made the damage permanent. A cruder malfunction that had printed a stock at a cent or at $1,000 would have been canceled. Knight's error was too well behaved to qualify for relief. The counterparties on the other side, meanwhile, had done nothing wrong and had made a great deal of money. They had simply been quoted bad prices by a firm that was insistently offering them, and they had accepted. There was no basis on which to ask for it back. It is worth being fair to Knight's people about what happened next, because under extreme pressure they executed well. A $7 billion book of unwanted positions is not something you can simply sell on a Wednesday afternoon. Dump it into the market, and you move prices against yourself, turning a $400 million loss into something considerably larger. Knight went to Goldman Sachs, which agreed to take the entire portfolio off their hands in a single block at a negotiated discount. That was the right call, taken fast. It converted an open-ended risk into a fixed, known loss on the same day. Every hour that book stayed open was an hour in which the number could grow. Then came the capital raise, and 48 hours to do it. Knight's management had to convince a group of sophisticated investors, several of them direct competitors, to put $400 million into a firm whose systems had just malfunctioned catastrophically and publicly. They succeeded over a weekend, and the market opened on Monday with Knight still trading. The terms were punishing. They were also the only terms available, and the alternative was liquidation. Shareholders lost around 3/4 of the company, but the firm's clients, counterparties, and employees were not left in a failed broker-dealer's wind-down. Given where they started on Wednesday morning, that is a decent outcome competently obtained. The regulatory response is instructive because it tells you what the authorities concluded the real problem was. The SEC did not write a rule about dead code. It could not sensibly have done so. No regulator can specify how firms manage a code base. What it did instead, in 2014, was adopt Regulation Systems Compliance and Integrity, Reg SCI, which applies to exchanges, clearing agencies and certain other significant market participants. Reg SCI requires covered entities to have written policies for the capacity, integrity, resiliency, and security of their systems, to test business continuity and disaster recovery, to review systems at least annually, and critically, to report systems disruptions and intrusions to the Commission. It made the operation of trading technology an explicit compliance obligation, rather than an internal engineering matter. Knight was not the sole cause. The 2010 flash crash, the botched BAT's initial public offering in March 2012, in which the exchange's own systems failed while listing its own shares, and the Facebook IPO problems at NASDAQ 2 months later had already made the case. Knight, arriving in August, was the fourth major technology failure in the American equity market in 28 months, and the first to destroy a firm. The pattern across those 4 events is the same, and it is not about complexity. It is about the absence of limits. In each case, a system did something unintended at machine speed, and in each case the question afterwards was not, why did it go wrong, but why was there nothing to stop it? The comparison that makes the point sharpest happened almost exactly a year later. On the 20th of August, 2013, Goldman Sachs suffered a strikingly similar accident. A change to an internal system caused it to send a flood of erroneous options orders to American exchanges in the first minutes of trading. Orders priced far from the market, on a large scale, generated automatically. The estimated exposure was in the hundreds of millions. Goldman survived it comfortably for 2 reasons. The options exchanges canceled or adjusted a large share of the trades, because options prices had moved far enough outside their bands to qualify as clearly erroneous. And Goldman's balance sheet could absorb what remained without any question of its solvency. Same category of failure, utterly different outcome. The variable was not engineering quality, it was capital and the accident of which rulebook applied. That is uncomfortable, and it is true. Knight died partly because its error was in equities rather than options, and partly because it was a firm with a few $100 million of capital rather than tens of billions. The distance between an expensive embarrassment and an extinction event was, in this instance, largely circumstantial, which raises the question of what it would have cost to survive it. Consider the control that would have made the biggest difference. An automatic hard stop that halts all trading when the firm's aggregate position exceeds a set threshold. Not a warning, not an email, an immediate cessation, requiring human authorization to resume. Knight's positions passed any sensible threshold within the first few minutes. A hard stop set at, say, $500 million of net exposure would have fired at around minute 3 or 4. The loss would have been perhaps $30 or $40 million. Painful, survivable, a bad quarter rather than the end of the company. The engineering to build that is not difficult. It is a running total, a comparison, and a switch. The reason firms did not have it in 2012 is that a hard stop occasionally fires when it should not, and a market maker that stops trading loses money and annoys clients. The cost of the control is visible and continuous. The cost of not having it is invisible until the one morning it matters. That asymmetry is why these controls tend to arrive only after somebody has demonstrated the need, and why regulation ends up being the mechanism that installs them. Left to a competitive market, the firm that runs without a hard stop has slightly better execution statistics every day except one. Now the general mechanism, because this is the part that outlives the specific firm. Dead code is not neutral. It is a liability that does not appear on any register. The reasoning that leaves it in place is always sound in isolation. Deleting code carries risk. You might remove something that turns out to be used. Deleting code costs time that could go to features. Nobody is rewarded for removing something that is already doing no harm. So it stays and it accumulates in every system of any age. The danger is that dead code does not decay in place. The system around it changes. Interfaces are refactored. Safety mechanisms are relocated. Assumptions are updated everywhere except in the part nobody is looking at. What was once safe becomes unsafe without anybody touching it. And because nobody touched it, nobody reviews it. Then somebody needs a switch and reaches for one that is conveniently free. That is the shape, and it is not confined to trading systems. It appears wherever an old capability is retained past its usefulness in a system that keeps evolving around it. A legacy payment path left enabled, an administrative account nobody has closed, a manual override that was needed during a migration in 2014 and never removed, a decommission process that still has database write permissions. Security professionals know this pattern well and call it attack surface. What Knight demonstrates is that you do not need an attacker. The system will find its own way to invoke the old path, given enough time and one tired deployment. There is a second lesson, and it is arguably the more useful one. Knight's operational failure was not the missed server. Deployments go wrong routinely, everywhere, and always will. The failure was that a single missed server on a single machine could reach a $7 billion position with nothing in between. Every control that would have contained this is boring, cheap, and was already standard practice elsewhere in 2012. Verify that deployed versions match across the fleet. Require a second pair of eyes on a production release. Set an automatic hard stop when the firm's position exceeds a threshold. And route genuine alerts somewhere a human is obliged to look. None of those prevent mistakes. They limit what a mistake can cost. That is the distinction that matters. And it is why the SEC framed its action around controls rather than around the error itself. The last thing worth saying is about speed, because it is what makes this era different. The panic of 1907 unfolded over weeks. The crash of 1929 took days to reach its worst. Even long-term capital management, which nearly took the system with it in 1998, gave regulators most of a month to organize a response. Knight lost more than its entire net worth in 45 minutes, and the mechanism that did it ran without a single human decision after the opening bell. There was no point at which somebody could have thought better of it, because nobody was thinking anything. The judgment had all been made years earlier, by people writing routine code for sensible reasons. That is the condition finance now operates in. The decisions are still human, but they are made in advance, embedded in software, and executed at a speed that leaves no room to reconsider. The gap between a decision and its consequences used to be where prudence lived. For $440 million on one August morning, that gap was 45 minutes long, and nobody was standing in it. The uncomfortable part is that nothing about the underlying condition has been solved. Code bases are older now, not newer. More of the market runs on automated systems than in 2012, and the systems are larger. What has changed is that the limits are better, hard stops, kill switches, version checks, mandatory reporting, because a firm was destroyed demonstrating why they were necessary. That is how this particular kind of safety usually arrives. Not from foresight and not from better engineers, but from somebody going first and not surviving it. Knight Capital's real legacy is not the loss. It is every automatic position limit in every trading system that was installed afterwards by people who read the report.